Women of the American Revolution. Stories of courage, faith, and strength that shaped a nation. By Mark Bureau. Copyright 2025 Mark R. Bureau. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical, without written permission from the author, except for brief quotations used in reviews or critical articles. Printed in the United States of America. Forward. The American Revolution is often remembered through the actions of generals, soldiers, and statesmen. Their names fill textbooks, monuments, and museums, standing as symbols of a nation determined to secure its independence. We remember the battles at Lexington and Concord, Saratoga, and Yorktown. We remember stirring speeches, bold declarations, and the leadership of figures such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. Their accomplishments deserve every measure of honor they receive. Yet history is rarely shaped by famous names alone. Behind every victory on the battlefield and every decision in the halls of government stood thousands of ordinary people whose quiet sacrifices made extraordinary achievements possible. Among those unsung heroes were the women of the American Revolution. They lived in uncertain times when every day brought new dangers and difficult choices. Husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons marched away to war, leaving homes, farms, and businesses in their care. Food became scarce, supplies were limited, communities were divided by political loyalties. Families often faced fear, poverty, illness, and grief, never knowing whether loved ones would return. In the midst of these hardships, women became the steady foundation upon which their families and neighborhoods depended. Some served the cause through remarkable acts of courage. They carried secret messages through enemy territory, gathered intelligence, warned militia companies of approaching danger, and protected vital information from British forces. Others stepped directly into the dangers of battle, refusing to retreat when the moment demanded courage. Their actions changed lives, influenced campaigns, and in some cases altered the course of history itself. Many more served in quieter ways that history too often overlooks. They mended uniforms, prepared food, cared for the wounded, raised children alone, harvested crops, managed family businesses, and kept entire communities functioning while war surrounded them. They welcomed weary soldiers into their homes, offered comfort to the sick, and shared what little they possessed with neighbors in need. Though their work seldom appeared in official reports, it sustained the Continental Army and strengthened the resolve of a struggling nation. Not every contribution came through physical labor or personal sacrifice. Some women changed minds with their words. Writers and poets reminded Americans why liberty mattered and encouraged perseverance when hope seemed distant. Their letters, essays, and poems inspired leaders, strengthened public resolve, and preserved the ideals that would define a new nation. Their voices demonstrated that wisdom, intelligence, and conviction were every bit as powerful as swords and muskets. This book honors 25 remarkable women whose lives reveal the many different ways courage can appear. Their stories span battlefields, frontier settlements, colonial towns, Native American communities, family homes, military camps, and places of quiet service. Some, such as Abigail Adams, Martha Washington, Molly Pitcher, Deborah Sampson, and Sybil Ludington, are familiar names to many readers. Others have remained largely forgotten despite lives equally deserving of remembrance. Together, they represent countless women whose contributions have too often remained in the shadows of history. No single volume could ever tell the stories of every woman who shaped the American Revolution. Thousands left no written records behind. Many performed their duties expecting neither praise nor recognition. Yet their influence survives in the freedoms that later generations inherited. Their examples remind us that history is not made only by those who command armies or sign historic documents. It is also written by those who quietly choose courage over fear, duty over comfort, and hope over despair. As you read these chapters, I invite you to look beyond the familiar names and famous events. Consider the ordinary moments that required extraordinary strength. Imagine the uncertainty they faced, the sacrifices they willingly accepted, and the faith that carried them through years of hardship. These women remind us that true leadership often begins with simple acts of compassion, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to others. May these pages help restore their voices to the story of America's founding. May they inspire a deeper appreciation for the countless women whose lives strengthened a struggling nation. Most of all, may they remind us that the legacy of courage belongs not only to those whose names appear in history books, but also to those whose quiet faithfulness made history possible. Their stories deserve to be remembered, shared, and celebrated for generations to come. Chapter 1: Abigail Adams. A quiet night in Quincy, where Abigail Adams writes by candlelight and keeps her family's hope alive. The candle in the window. The night wind moved through the thin cracks of the Quincy farmhouse, carrying with it the cold of a New England autumn. Inside, Abigail Adams sat at her writing desk, a single candle burning low, its flame bending and recovering as the draft passed by. The quiet of the house was deep. The children were asleep. The chores of the day were finally behind her, and for a rare moment, she had stillness long enough to think. She dipped her feather quill into the ink and paused. She had written so many letters by now to her husband, to her friends, to her sisters, but every time she sat down, she felt the same slow gathering of feeling in her chest. Words mattered. Words traveled. Words held people together when distance, war, and worry kept them apart. She lifted her head, listening for a moment. Nothing but the soft groaning of the house beams and the distant low of a cow in the barn. The world had been so tense for so long that stillness now felt unfamiliar. Abigail breathed out slowly and brought the quill above the page. "My dearest friend." That was how she always began letters to her husband. Not Sir, not John, not husband, but friend, because that was what they were before anything else. Before politics, before family, before the weight of an entire country began pressing down on his shoulders. They were two minds that understood each other. Two hearts that leaned toward each other even when the miles stretched impossibly far. She continued writing, her hand steady even as her heart ached with the familiar mixture of pride and loneliness. John was away again in Congress, traveling, debating, building something that didn't yet exist, a nation. While he worked among the men who argued about liberty, she lived among the children who needed shoes, the neighbors who needed medicine, and the farm that needed labor, all while the fear of war lay like a shadow behind every sunrise. She never resented him, but she felt the weight of two lives, the one she lived and the one she watched from afar through the letters he sent. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the shutters. Abigail glanced at the window, then back at her candle, lowering it slightly so the flame wouldn't blow out. She could remember a time not long ago when she had to do this quietly so as not to disturb the soldiers sleeping in the yard. War had come close that winter, too close. Men marched through the roads near her home carrying muskets over their shoulders, their faces pale with cold and fear. The sound of distant gunfire had once echoed across the hills. She had gathered her children near the hearth and waited until the noise faded, whispering prayers she hoped they couldn't hear the tremor in. Women learned to live with fear faster than men did. They had no choice. Fear didn't pause for milking cows or hungry children or firewood that needed chopping. Fear lived alongside daily work, not instead of it. As she wrote, the candle flickered again, and she paused, resting her hand on the page. She thought of John, the way his face tightened when he was thinking, the way he walked in circles when he was frustrated, the way he always pressed her hand before leaving. He had asked for her thoughts often, more often than most wives were asked. He respected her mind, sometimes more than he respected his own. Her advice, her insight, her ability to see beyond the immediate moment, these were not qualities she had learned from books so much as from living. She would never have described herself as a leader, not in the way men used the word. But she led quietly in her home, in her letters, in the small community that looked to her when uncertainty swept over them like the New England storms. A woman's leadership didn't require a vote or a speech. It required endurance. It required steadiness. It required faith. She wrote another line, then breathed in the warm scent of the candle wax melting down its sides. There were times when she felt that her letters were the only bridge between her world and his. She told him about the harvest, about the neighbors' illnesses, about shortages of salt and sugar. But she also told him about ideas, about fairness, about the responsibilities of men who sought freedom, and about what kind of nation her children deserved to inherit. Tonight, though, the words came slower, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she felt the ache of missing him more sharply than usual. She could almost see him reading her letter, eyebrows raised, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. She imagined him setting it aside gently, folding it carefully as he always did. She never wrote for praise. She wrote to keep him grounded, to remind him that while he spoke of liberty and justice, there was a world beyond the meeting halls, a world of kitchens and laundry kettles, of fields and children, of women who carried the burdens the war left at their doorsteps. She finished another paragraph and set down the quill, rubbing her hand. A low ache settled in her wrist. Too much writing, too much weaving, too much lifting that was the life of a woman with a household to maintain. Abigail stood and walked quietly to the window. Beyond it, the night pressed dark and heavy. The moon sat low, half hidden behind a bank of clouds. She touched the window latch gently, feeling the cold seep through. "Come home soon," she whispered into the glass, though she knew he wouldn't. Not yet. The country needed him. The world was changing. And change always came with a price. She had always known that his path would be heavy. She had accepted it willingly. But sometimes, especially at night, she wished life allowed her to be selfish just once. She sat again, straightened her paper, and dipped her quill once more. She told him that the baby had taken his first steps. She told him that little Charles had been scolded for climbing the fence. She told him that Nabby had a cough but was improving, and she ended the letter with what she always ended it with, words that came from a part of her heart she rarely spoke aloud. "You are the soul of my life. We wait for your return." She sealed the letter with wax, pressed her small stamp into it, and held it until it cooled. Then she carried it to the door and set it where the post-rider would find it in the morning. The house felt colder when she returned to her desk. She blew out the candle, leaving the room in soft darkness. Before going to bed, she paused at the window once more. A single star flickered through a thin opening in the clouds. She watched it for several long seconds, letting the quiet of the moment rest over her like a blanket. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know when the war would end, or when her husband would return, or how their children would grow in a world shaken by conflict. But she knew herself. She knew her strength. She knew her devotion to her family, to her marriage, to the fragile hope of a new nation. And she knew that history often remembered the loudest voices, but the future was built just as surely by the quiet hands of women who kept the candles burning. She pulled the curtains closed and turned toward the stairs, her footsteps gentle on the wooden floor. In the quiet house, on a quiet night, Abigail Adams carried the weight of a world she never asked for, and the strength to bear it anyway. Chapter 2. Martha Washington. Martha Washington hands supplies to the soldiers she cared for during the long winter months, a hearth in a time of war. The winter wind moved across the camp at Valley Forge and carried with it the smell of smoke and frozen earth. Canvas tents stood in long rows, and the hills around them were bare of leaves. Soldiers walked with slow steps and tired shoulders, wrapped in coats that did little to stop the cold. It was a harsh and unforgiving place. Martha Washington arrived in the middle of it with a calm face and steady hands. She had traveled for days to reach her husband. Roads were rough and food was scarce. Yet she came every winter without complaint. She believed a wife should stand beside her husband when the world grew heavy. When she reached the camp, she stepped down from the carriage and felt the bitter air cut across her cheeks. She greeted the soldiers with a quiet nod before she was brought to the small quarters set aside for General Washington. Inside, a small fire burned low in a stone hearth. Martha warmed her hands and listened to the sounds outside. Hammers struck against wood. Tools scraped on frozen ground. Men coughed in the cold. War was not only fought on fields, it lived in the waiting, the hunger, the long winter nights. She understood this as well as any soldier. When George Washington entered the room, he looked older than he had the year before. His shoulders sagged with the burden of command and with the lives that depended on his decisions. When he saw his wife, his face softened. Martha stepped toward him without hurry and placed her hands in his. They exchanged no grand words. They did not need any. Presence itself was comfort. Each day, Martha worked as hard as any person in the camp. She visited the sick. She cooked meals when supplies allowed it. She mended shirts and stockings. She sewed blankets late into the evening. She spoke kindly to soldiers who were far from home and worn thin by hardship. Many said that hope seemed to follow wherever she walked. Martha also brought order to the small room where she lived with her husband. She cleaned the hearth and kept the fire burning. She placed a small cloth across the rough table and set a single candle at its center. Little signs of home made the cold camp feel less harsh. Washington often said that her presence reminded him of the world he wanted the country to become, a world of peace and dignity. Outside, the men built huts of logs and mud. Martha watched from the doorway of her quarters as they worked in the bitter wind. She admired their strength and their quiet loyalty. In the evenings, she warmed broth for those too weak to stand. She listened to their stories. She prayed with those who asked. Her voice was always gentle, never raised, never hurried. It soothed men who had seen far more than they wished to remember. There were nights when the cold settled so deeply that even the strongest spirits struggled. Martha would walk through the camp with a lantern, checking on the sick. The soldiers lifted their heads when they saw her. She spoke soft words of comfort, telling them that spring would come and that better days waited ahead. Her faith did not shine in grand speeches. It lived in the quiet moments. Inside the Washington quarters, she wrote letters to friends and family. She told them little about the suffering around her. Instead, she wrote of courage and small joys. She wrote about the way the fire warmed the room and about the kindness of the soldiers who carried water for her. She believed that even in a hard place, one could find goodness. Washington often returned late from meetings with his officers. Martha would pour him tea and listen as he spoke of the army, of supply shortages, of men without shoes, of the weight of command. She offered no political advice. She offered steadiness. The general would sit quietly, one hand around the warm cup, and breathe easier simply because she was near. On the coldest nights, they sat beside the fire with only the crackling wood between them. Sometimes they talked about their farm in Virginia, about the gardens, about the horses, about the life waiting for them after the war. Other times, they said nothing at all. Silence between two people who love each other can be a kind of shelter. Martha knew this. She offered that shelter without effort. Her work in the camp spread beyond her own table. She organized other officers' wives who had come to help. Together, they sewed shirts and knitted socks. They packed small bundles of food for the weakest soldiers. They did what they could with the little they had. Martha believed that war demanded strength from all who lived through it, not only from those who carried muskets. As winter dragged on, illness swept through the camp. Martha spent long hours beside the sick, wiping brows, holding hands, and whispering prayers. She did not shrink from the hard tasks. She believed kindness could be a kind of medicine. When spring finally approached, the snow melted into mud and the air grew softer. Soldiers stood straighter. Hope returned slowly. Martha watched the change with quiet satisfaction. She had seen the lowest days of the winter and knew how close despair had come. Her presence had helped hold the camp together in ways that were never written in reports. When the time came for her to return home, she packed her few belongings and folded the blankets she had sewn. She looked around the small room one last time. It had been a place of waiting and worry, yet also a place of warmth because she had made it so. She embraced her husband before stepping into the mild spring air. She did not cry. She trusted that they would see each other again when winter returned. She knew he would need her then as much as he needed her now. As the carriage pulled away from Valley Forge, soldiers raised their hands in farewell. Martha waved back with a small smile. Her presence had given them comfort in the darkest months. She carried their gratitude with her as she traveled the long road home. In the years that followed, many told stories of battles and great decisions. Few spoke of the quiet woman who brought hope to a frozen camp. Yet her strength lived in every soldier she encouraged, and in every night that felt less cold because she kept a small fire burning. Martha Washington was not a warrior in the usual sense, yet she fought with kindness, faith, and calm endurance. In a time of war, she became a hearth for those who had none, and a steady light for the man who led them. Chapter 3. Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley at her writing desk where faith and thought shaped her poetry. The quiet courage of a poet. The morning light entered the small Boston room through a narrow window, touching the wooden floorboards with a soft glow. Phillis Wheatley sat beside her writing table, her thin hands folded over a sheet of paper. She took a quiet breath as she listened to the stir of the household waking around her. She was used to rising early. It was the only time she had complete silence, and silence was the place where her poems began. She dipped her quill into the inkwell and let her eyes rest on the page before her. She never hurried. Words came to her gently. She listened for them more than she chased them. Her mind moved between memory and imagination, between the world she saw and the world she hoped to see someday. Phillis had been taken from her home in Africa when she was a child. She did not remember the name of her village or the faces of the people who loved her. Those memories had disappeared into the long, painful journey that brought her to Boston. She arrived on the Wheatley ship when she was about 7 years old, small, frightened, and wrapped in nothing but a piece of cloth against the cold harbor wind. The Wheatley family took her in, and although she lived in their home as an enslaved girl, they treated her with an unusual kindness for the time. They taught her to read, they encouraged her writing, they allowed her a freedom of thought that was rare and precious. Still, she carried her past inside her. It shaped her. It deepened her faith. It made her grateful for every book she touched and every moment she was allowed to learn. On this quiet morning, she began to write a new line. Her hand moved with care across the page. She wrote about light. She wrote about struggle. She wrote about hope. She believed that poetry was not only a gift, It was a way to rise above sorrow and to speak truth without anger. Words were her strength, and strength was something she had needed since she was a child. Footsteps passed the room as Mrs. Wheatley moved through the hall. The sounds of mourning began to fill the house. The fire was lit in the kitchen. The kettle began to warm. Voices drifted in from outside as neighbors greeted each other in the street. Phyllis continued writing, her eyes focused on the curve of each letter. In the afternoons, she spent time reading the poets she admired. She read Milton and Pope. She read the Psalms. She read anything that brought her closer to understanding the world of language. When she wrote her first poem, Mrs. Wheatley read it with surprise. The words came from a young girl who had once arrived with no English at all. The Wheatleys encouraged her, and soon her poems began to appear in local papers. Yet, even with praise, Phyllis felt the weight of doubt. People questioned how a young African girl could write with such grace. Some claimed she had copied someone else. Others believed it was impossible for someone of her background to possess such talent. Phyllis knew these doubts well. She felt them in the gaze of strangers. She felt them in the whispered questions of men who had never taken the time to learn her name. Her answer to doubt was never anger. It was patience. It was faith. It was another poem. One day she wrote a poem addressed to General George Washington. She admired him from afar. She believed he was chosen for a purpose, and that his leadership carried a seriousness she could sense even through distant reports. She sent the poem with a humble note. She believed he might appreciate the words, even if he never wrote back. Weeks passed before she received his reply. She opened the letter with trembling hands. She read his words slowly, hardly believing her eyes. He thanked her. He praised her talent. He invited her to visit him if she ever traveled to his headquarters. His letter became a treasured piece of her life. It showed her that her voice mattered. It showed her that her gift reached people she admired. Her growing reputation brought her beyond Boston. Friends of the Wheatley family encouraged her to publish a book of poetry. Boston printers refused, claiming the public would not buy a book written by an African girl. It was a hard moment for Phyllis, but she did not stop writing. She did not lose faith. A friend arranged the publication of her book in London. Phyllis traveled there with the Wheatley family's support. In London, she found more acceptance. She met people who recognized her brilliance without hesitation. She watched the pages of her book come to life in the hands of printers. When the book was finally placed in her hands, she held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of her own journey. She had come from a ship that carried her in chains, and now she held a book that carried her words across the world. After returning to America, life changed quickly. Mrs. Wheatley fell ill. Mr. Wheatley passed away. Phyllis faced new uncertainty. Even though she was later freed, freedom came with hardship. She married a man who struggled to find steady work. She lived through poverty and loss. Her health weakened, yet her faith remained steady. She continued to write when she could. Her poems had always been a bridge between her past and her hope for the future. There were days when she sat quietly by a window, watching the sunlight move across the floor, remembering her childhood, remembering the years spent learning to read, remembering the kindness she had received and the strength she had needed. Her life had been marked by sorrow, but it had also been shaped by a purpose she could feel deeply. People often spoke of the Revolution as a time of soldiers and battles. But there were other kinds of courage. Phyllis had shown a quieter kind, a courage of mind and spirit. She faced the doubt of others with patience. She faced hardship with grace. She used her words to lift her world instead of condemning it. On evenings when the house was still, she would place her hands on her folded poems and whisper a prayer of thanks. She believed her voice had been given to her for a reason. She believed she had used it the best she could. Her poems traveled much farther than she ever could. They reached people who needed hope. They spoke of light when darkness seemed near. Phillis Wheatley lived a life few could imagine, and even fewer could have endured with such peace. She rose from a childhood of loss and found her strength in words. She lifted her nation in a quiet way and reminded it that courage does not always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it speaks with a gentleness that can reach a general and touch a young country searching for its soul. Chapter 4. Sybil Ludington. Sybil Ludington rides through the storm to warn the militia of the danger ahead. The night ride of a young patriot. The rain had already begun to fall when Sybil Ludington stepped out onto the porch of her family home. The sky was dark and low, and the wind carried the sharp scent of the storm. She was 16 years old, and her hands trembled only for a moment before she steadied them on the railing. Her father stood beside her, his face tight with worry and urgency. The news he brought had changed the night. British troops were burning homes and farms near Danbury. The militia needed to gather at once. Someone had to warn the men spread across the countryside. There was little time, and no one else could ride fast enough or far enough. Sybil looked at her father and then at the road that disappeared into the dark. She felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Most people thought of her as a quiet girl who helped with the daily chores. They did not know the strength she carried within her. She felt fear, but she also felt purpose. She nodded once. Her father placed his hand gently on her arm, not to stop her, but to give her the courage he saw growing in her eyes. Her horse, Star, stamped the wet ground and tossed his head. Sybil ran her hand down his neck and whispered to him. She had ridden him since she was a child, and he trusted her completely. She tightened the saddle straps and swung herself up in a single smooth motion. Rain tapped against her face as she gathered the reins. Her father gave her one final look. He did not need to speak. Everything he felt was in his eyes. Sybil pressed her heels gently into Star's sides. The horse leaped forward, and the road rose up to meet them. The night closed around her with the storm. Trees swayed in the wind, and shadows ran across the ground like something alive. The cold rain soaked her shoulders, and her hair clung to her face. She blinked the water away and fixed her gaze on the path ahead. She rode toward the first farmhouse, the hooves striking the wet earth with steady rhythm. When she reached the door, she called out, her voice carrying through the storm. The militia had to gather at once. The British were moving fast. She saw a candle flare inside. A man stepped out, grateful, alert, and hurried. Sybil did not stay to answer questions. She turned Star and rode toward the next home. House after house, farm after farm. The storm grew heavier. The wind pushed against her shoulders. At times, she had to lower her head completely to keep the rain from blinding her. Star moved with powerful strides. Sybil leaned forward, urging him on. Her legs ached and her hands stiffened on the reins, but she did not slow. She rode through puddles that splashed up to her skirt. She rode past stone walls and sleeping fields. She rode until her voice grew hoarse from calling out to families. At every house, she saw men grab muskets, pull on boots, and step into the storm. She knew that many of them would face danger before the sun rose again. She also knew that without warning, they might never have a chance to defend their homes. The darkness grew deeper as clouds covered the moon. The woods pressed close to the road, and the branches seemed to reach for her. She passed a creek that had overflowed with rain and crossed it carefully, knowing one slip could end her ride. Her breath came in short bursts. Her heart beat hard in her chest. Yet she felt a strength rise inside her with every mile. Fear could not stop her. The cause was greater than her fear. She rode for hour after hour. 20 miles became 30, 30 became 40. The rain eased for a moment, and a thin strip of moonlight touched the road ahead. Sybil lifted her face toward it and whispered a prayer for strength. Her clothes clung to her skin. Her hands were numb. Star's sides were damp with sweat and rain. Still, she pressed on. When she reached a hilltop, she slowed her horse and looked down at the valley below. Lights flickered in several distant homes. Her voice had reached them. The men were gathering. The militia would stand. She took a long breath and let it out slowly. The storm was not over, but she had carried the message farther than anyone could have expected. Her courage had traveled on the wind. She turned Star toward home and continued her ride. Exhaustion pulled at her muscles, but she moved with steady determination. Dawn was beginning to touch the horizon by the time she reached her family's yard. Her father waited with a lantern held high. He rushed forward as she slowed Star to a halt. He rested his hand on her leg and looked up at her with a mixture of pride and relief. She could not speak at first. She leaned down and rested her forehead on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her and held her for a long moment. The militia gathered in time because of her. The men moved quickly. They reached the burning homes at Danbury and fought back the British forces. The losses were real and painful, but without Sybil's ride, the devastation would have been far greater. Her courage had given her community the chance to stand and defend itself. In the days that followed, Sybil returned to her chores. She fed the chickens. She helped with the laundry. She carried water from the well. Her family knew what she had done, and so did the men she had warned. Yet Sybil did not seek praise. She felt no need to tell the story again. She had done what needed to be done. That was enough for her. People often spoke of famous rides during the war, stories of danger and determination. Few knew the name Sybil Ludington, the young girl who rode twice as far as many celebrated riders. But history does not always remember every hero loudly. Some heroes live in the shadows of storms and in the courage of hearts that refuse to fail. Sybil was one of them. Years later, when she was grown with a family of her own, she would think back to that stormy night. She would remember the sound of Star's hooves. She would remember the cold rain and the dark road. She would remember the fear and the fire inside her that would not go out. She had been young and small, yet she had carried the hopes of an entire community through a storm. Sybil Ludington did not fight with a musket. She fought with determination. She fought with endurance. She fought with a willingness to act when others hesitated. Her long ride served a cause far greater than herself. It proved that courage does not belong to age or rank or even experience. Sometimes it belongs to a young girl on a stormy night whose heart refuses to fail. Chapter 5. Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson sits among the soldiers she served beside, her disguise strong and her resolve even stronger. The woman who became a soldier. The night air around the Continental camp carried the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Soldiers moved between the tents with heavy steps, their boots sinking into the soft ground after a long day of marching. The voices of men drifted through the darkness. Someone laughed near the fire. Someone coughed in the cold. A horse snorted at the edge of the camp. The familiar mix of exhaustion and purpose lay over everything. In the middle of it stood a young soldier who called herself Robert Shirtliff. Her coat was worn and heavy on her shoulders. Her musket rested against her leg. No one in the camp knew that Robert was really Deborah Sampson. She kept her voice low. She kept her movements steady and controlled. She did everything she could to blend in with the men around her, but inside her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. Deborah had slipped into this life because she could not bear to stand aside while others fought. She wanted purpose. She wanted to serve. She wanted to prove that strength did not belong to men alone. So, she cut her hair. She bound her chest. She chose a new name and stepped into the ranks of the Continental Army without hesitation. The first days had been the hardest. She had worried that her voice might give her away. She had worried someone might question the way she moved. But the men around her were too tired and too focused on survival to look closely at the quiet soldier who kept to herself. They saw her lift her musket. They saw her march without complaint. They saw her work harder than many of the others, and slowly she became part of their world. Tonight, she sat near the fire, sharpening her bayonet. Sparks jumped as the blade slid across the metal stone. The glow of the fire touched her face and gave it a warm reflection. She listened to the men talk about their homes and their families. She listened to the sound of the crackling fire. She said little, but she took in everything around her. A sudden shout broke the quiet rhythm of the camp. Officers hurried through the rows of tents, calling the soldiers to form up at once. Deborah rose quickly, grabbed her musket, and joined the line. The night sky above her was thick with clouds, and the moon hid behind them. The officers spoke in low, urgent tones. Enemy scouts had been seen in the woods. The company needed to move out before dawn and prepare for a possible attack. Deborah felt a familiar rush of nerves in her stomach. This was the life she had chosen. She tightened her belt and checked the flint on her musket. The men around her moved with the sharp focus of soldiers who understood danger. No one questioned her presence. No one suspected the truth. Before dawn, the company marched out, their steps muffled by the damp ground. Deborah kept pace at the center of the line. Her breath formed soft clouds in the cold air. Her musket weighed heavily on her shoulder, but she did not falter. The trees on either side of the road rose like dark walls. Birds stirred in the branches. The light in the sky brightened by slow degrees. When they reached a clearing, the soldiers spread out and took positions behind fallen logs and low stone walls. Deborah knelt behind a thick stump. Her hands were steady. She could feel her heart beating beneath her coat. She whispered a final prayer and waited. The first shots came from the far edge of the clearing. Sharp cracks echoed through the trees. Deborah pressed herself against the ground as bullets cut through branches overhead. Officers shouted commands. Muskets fired in answer. Smoke drifted across the field, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Deborah rose to one knee, lifted her musket, and fired into the dense line of trees before her. The recoil struck her shoulder, but she did not flinch. She reloaded quickly, moving with practiced skill. Another volley sounded. A branch splintered near her head. She reloaded again, hands working through the motions she had learned so carefully. A soldier beside her cried out and fell back, clutching his leg. Deborah slid toward him and helped drag him behind cover. He groaned in pain and looked up at her with gratitude. She wanted to say something kind, but she had to get back into position. The fight was far from over. For hours, the battle surged back and forth. Deborah fired until her musket barrel grew warm. She moved through smoke and fear with a calm she did not fully understand. She worked alongside the men as if she had been born into this life. She felt alive in a way she never had before. She felt the purpose she had been seeking. When the enemy finally withdrew, the soldiers collapsed where they stood. Deborah sank to the ground and leaned her back against a tree. Sweat and rain mixed on her skin. Her coat was torn at the sleeve, but she barely noticed. She had survived. Her secret had survived with her. The officers praised the company for their courage. They spoke of the ground they had held. They spoke of the lives saved. Deborah accepted the praise silently. She had never sought glory. She had only wanted to stand where her heart told her to stand. In the days that followed, Deborah continued to serve with the same steadiness. She dug trenches, she hauled supplies, she cared for the wounded when she could. The men around her treated her like any other soldier. They trusted her. They respected her. She earned her place not by pretending to be someone else, but by living with honor. Yet there were moments when the strain of her secret weighed heavily on her. Times when she had to hide injuries for fear of discovery. Times when she turned away so no one would see the softness of her features. Times when she wondered how long she could maintain the disguise. Her greatest test came during another fight when a bullet grazed her leg. Pain shot through her body, but she refused to fall. She wrapped the wound as best she could and continued forward. She feared a surgeon might uncover the truth if she asked for help. So she stitched the wound herself, biting down on a strip of cloth to keep from crying out. The pain nearly overwhelmed her, but she endured it. Eventually, she could no longer hide her injuries. Fever set in and her strength faded. She was taken to a medical tent where a doctor discovered the truth she had carried for so long. She waited in fear of punishment. Instead, she received something unexpected: respect, admiration, the understanding that she had served bravely and had earned her place in the army. The officers granted her an honorable discharge. Her time as a soldier had ended, but her courage did not fade. In the years that followed, she spoke to others about her service. She wanted people to know that bravery belonged to anyone who chose it. She wanted them to see that honor came from action and not from the name someone carried. Deborah Sampson had lived a life many believed impossible. She had fought as a soldier. She had survived battles and hardship. She had kept her secret through the darkest moments, and she had proven that courage does not belong to men alone. It belongs to the hearts that refuse to be quiet when the world calls them forward. Chapter 6. Mercy Otis Warren. Mercy Otis Warren writes the words that helped guide a young nation. A pen that shaped a revolution. The morning sun rested softly on the Otis home in Barnstable, casting warm light across the wooden floors and the shelves filled with books. Mercy Otis Warren sat at her writing table, a candle still burning beside her even though the day had begun. She often wrote at this hour when the house was quiet and her thoughts were clear. Her quill rested between her fingers as she listened to the distant sounds of the village beginning its day. She could hear a cart rolling over the dirt road and a rooster calling from a nearby yard. Mercy dipped her quill into the inkwell and touched it gently to the paper. She wrote slowly at first, feeling her ideas gather. She wrote plays, poems, and long letters filled with sharp insight about the world around her. She believed that words were more than ink on a page. They were instruments of change. They shaped people's thoughts and gave courage to those who feared the uncertain future. Her brothers had grown up learning law and politics. Mercy learned these things as well, not from classrooms, but from conversations she was never meant to hear. She listened from doorways and stairwells as men discussed the rising tensions with Britain. She absorbed every detail. Her mind worked quickly, and she began writing her own thoughts long before anyone outside her home knew of her talent. She grew into a woman who understood the world more deeply than many men of her time. She was patient, thoughtful, and observant. She wrote with purpose. She wrote with a steady hand. And she wrote with a conviction that the colonies were meant to stand as a free people. As the years passed, Mercy became a trusted voice among the patriots. She wrote plays that mocked tyranny and celebrated the courage of common people. Audiences who read her work did not know her name. Many assumed the author was a man. Mercy did not correct them. She cared only that her words reached hearts and stirred them. Her friend Abigail Adams often wrote to her, sharing ideas and worries. The two women encouraged each other and found strength in their shared belief that the colonies stood on the edge of something important. Mercy's home became a gathering place for discussions about the future. People came to talk with her husband James, but many left speaking of Mercy instead. They admired her intelligence and the quiet certainty in her voice. Today, she continued writing a new piece. The words flowed more easily now. She wrote about fairness. She wrote about the risks people must take to defend liberty. She wrote about the responsibility that leaders carried. She believed that the pen could guide the future as surely as any army. A knock sounded at the door. James entered the room with a letter in his hand. He placed it gently beside her papers and kissed her on the forehead. Then he returned to his duties without interrupting her thoughts further. Mercy opened the letter and recognized the handwriting of Samuel Adams. He wrote to her often. He valued her insight and believed her opinions were as important as those of any advisor. She read his message and felt a familiar spark of purpose. Samuel asked for her thoughts on a new development in Boston. She laid the letter aside and began writing a thoughtful reply. Her words were careful but strong. She spoke of courage. She spoke of justice. She spoke of the need for unity. She hoped her letter would give him clarity as he prepared for the difficult days ahead. When she finished, she sealed the letter with wax and placed it near the door. A rider would come soon to pick it up. Mercy returned to her writing table and continued her work. She often wrote late into the afternoon, leaving only to tend to her household duties. She believed that a woman could serve her family and her country at the same time. Her strength came from her ability to balance both roles. As tension between the colonies and Britain grew, so did Mercy's influence. Her words traveled through towns and cities. People read her plays and felt braver. They read her essays and felt wiser. She never raised her voice in a crowd. She never marched in uniform. She fought with quiet determination, shaping the hearts and minds of people she had never met. During the early years of the war, news traveled slowly. Mercy waited anxiously for updates from the battlefields. Each letter brought a mix of relief and sorrow. She prayed for the safety of the men fighting for freedom. She prayed for the country they hoped to build. She prayed for the strength to continue supporting them with her writing. One autumn evening, she sat by the fire with her husband. The crackling flames cast shadows on the walls. Mercy held a fresh page of writing in her lap. James asked her what she was working on. She smiled and told him it was a story about courage. He nodded, knowing that her stories always carried a message deeper than their surface. She read a few lines aloud. Her voice was soft but steady. The words told of a common man who chose to stand against injustice. The character was fictional, but the meaning was real. When she finished reading, James reached over and squeezed her hand. He told her that her writing gave people strength in a time when fear could easily take hold. Mercy continued to write long after most people had retired for the night. She believed that the pen could be a beacon in dark times. She believed that future generations would look back on these days and understand the cost of freedom. She wanted her words to help them see the truth of the moment. When the war ended, Mercy did not put down her pen. She continued to write about the new nation and the challenges it faced. She believed that the people needed guidance to stay true to the principles they had fought for. Her final work, A History of the Revolution, became one of the earliest accounts written from a personal perspective. Years later, when she looked back on her life, Mercy felt no regret. She had lived with purpose. She had spoken with honesty. She had given her gifts to a country she loved. Her influence stretched far beyond what she could see. Her words had touched hearts and shaped minds. She had shown that courage could take many forms. Sometimes it lived in the quiet strength of a woman with a pen and a belief that her voice mattered. Mercy Otis Warren left behind a legacy built not on battles but on ideas. She proved that a revolution needed more than soldiers. It needed thinkers. It needed storytellers. It needed people who could see a better future and help others imagine it. She became one of those people, and her voice continued to echo long after the final shot of the war. Chapter 7. Molly Pitcher, Mary Ludwig Hayes. Molly Pitcher steps forward at the cannon, carrying water, strength, and courage to the battlefield. Carrying water and courage to the battlefield. The heat that rose from the fields of Monmouth that June afternoon felt almost otherworldly. The sun hung high and harsh in the sky, and its light shimmered over the ground like a living flame. The air itself seemed to tremble. Soldiers stumbled as they marched. Their coats clung to their backs, and their breaths came in short gasps. Sweat rolled down their faces and soaked the cloth beneath their collars. Some men collapsed on the field before a single shot had been fired. Molly Pitcher moved through the chaos with determination. Her real name was Mary Ludwig Hayes, but in the camp, the men had begun calling her Molly Pitcher because of the way she carried water to the soldiers during the long, hot days. She lifted the heavy pails with practiced strength and walked from man to man without hesitation. Her feet sank into the warm earth. Her arms burned from the effort, yet she moved with purpose, driven by a sense of duty that made her ignore her own discomfort. The battle had reached a fevered pitch. Cannon fire shook the ground. Muskets cracked in rapid bursts. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the heat until the air felt thick with smoke and fire. Molly wove her way through the soldiers and offered water to anyone who needed it. Some gulped it with gratitude. Others barely had the strength to lift the cup to their lips. She moved on quickly, knowing the men at the cannon needed her help most of all. Her husband, William Hayes, served on an artillery crew. She found him beside a cannon near the edge of the field. His face was lined with sweat and soot. His shirt clung to his back. The cannon crew worked without pause. One man loaded powder, another rammed the shot. A third lit the fuse. The boom of the cannon shook Molly's chest each time it fired. She handed William a drink and offered water to the rest of the crew. They nodded their thanks, but did not slow their work. The British forces pressed hard against the American lines, and the cannon fire was essential to holding them back. Molly stepped back to refill her pitcher when a sudden crash tore through the noise. A cannon shot struck near the crew. Dirt and smoke exploded upward. Molly shielded her face with her arm. When the cloud lifted, she saw William on the ground. He had not been struck by a bullet, but the heat and exhaustion had finally taken him. His body lay still. A medic rushed to help him, but the officer shouted that the cannon could not fall silent, not even for a moment. Molly looked at her husband and felt the fear rise in her chest. Yet she also knew the truth. Without the cannon, the line might break. Without the line, the battle might be lost. She wiped her face with her sleeve and stepped toward the artillery crew. The men hesitated for a moment. They knew her. They trusted her. And the need was greater than any rule that said only men should run a cannon. She took her husband's place. Her hands moved with fierce determination. She lifted the rammer and pushed it deep into the barrel. The heat inside the metal tube felt like a furnace, but she did not flinch. She worked as quickly as she could. The men beside her loaded powder and shot. A fuse was lit. The cannon roared again. Molly stepped back as the blast shook the ground beneath them. For a moment, the men looked at her with surprise. Then they looked forward again. She had become part of the crew. Her energy matched theirs. Her resolve steadied their own. She worked through the sweat that stung her eyes and the heat that wrapped itself around her like a crushing weight. She moved with the strength of someone who understood that courage was not something one waited for. Courage was something one chose. Shot after shot thundered across the field. Molly's arms grew heavy. Her back screamed with pain. Yet she continued. She rammed the cannon repeatedly. She stepped away each time the flame touched the fuse. Smoke filled her lungs. The sun beat mercilessly on the back of her neck. Her hair clung to her face. Still, she did not stop. The soldiers around her began to shout her name. Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher. The name carried across the field, rising above the thunder of the cannon. She felt her heart swell, but she did not let herself be distracted. She worked with steady hands and fierce concentration. An officer approached her when a moment of calm settled over the field. He looked at her with a mixture of respect and astonishment. He told her she had earned a place among the bravest at Monmouth. She nodded once and returned to her work. Praise could wait, victory could not. As the battle stretched into the evening, the heat began to ease, but the work did not. The cannon crew continued with Molly at its heart. She helped them fire until the British forces finally began to retreat. Cheers erupted from the American lines. The men threw their hats into the air and shouted in triumph. Molly stood beside the cannon, exhausted, covered in soot, and breathing hard. She felt the trembling of her own hands as she lowered the rammer for the final time. William survived the day, though he remained weak from exhaustion. Molly knelt beside him and pressed her hand to his cheek. His eyes opened slowly, and he whispered her name. She smiled. She told him the battle had been won. She told him that the cannon had not fallen silent. He smiled faintly and closed his eyes again. She sat beside him for a long moment, feeling both relief and pride. In the days that followed, the story of Molly Pitcher spread through the American camp. Soldiers spoke of the woman who had taken her husband's place at the cannon. They spoke of her strength. They spoke of her fearlessness. They spoke of the courage that had burned in her eyes when the smoke and fire of battle had surrounded her. Molly never sought the praise. She knew she had done what needed to be done. She knew she had stood where she was needed. She knew she had honored the men she fought beside. Her bravery became a symbol of the quiet courage found in unexpected places. She had shown that even in the heat of battle, even amid chaos, a woman's strength could rise to meet the moment. Years later, when she looked back on her life, Molly remembered the heat of that day and the sound of the cannon. She remembered the weight of the rammer in her hands. She remembered the sight of soldiers rallying as the tide of battle turned. She remembered the feeling of purpose that filled her heart. She knew that her actions had shaped the story of that day in a way that would be remembered. Molly Pitcher remained a reminder that bravery comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes in the swing of a rammer against a cannon barrel. Sometimes it comes in the steady hands of a woman who steps forward when no one expects her to. She became a legend not because she sought glory, but because she refused to let fear silence the courage that lived within her. Chapter 8. Nancy Hart. Nancy Hart stands firm before the intruders, using courage and wit to protect her home. The frontier woman who stood her ground. The land around Nancy Hart's cabin in the backwoods of Georgia felt wild and untamed. Tall trees pressed close to the clearing, and the forest floor was covered with thick brush that crackled under the weight of any creature that dared to cross it. The air carried the scent of pine and smoke from her hearth. This was a place where danger could move quietly through the trees, and Nancy Hart had learned long ago to listen for anything out of place. Her cabin stood alone along the edge of a narrow creek. The logs were rough and weathered. The single window let in only a thin strip of light during the day. Inside, the fire burned with a slow glow and cast long shadows across the walls. Nancy moved through the room with steady steps. Her strong hands placed a pot over the fire. Her sharp eyes watched everything at once. She lived a life where one moment of inattention could bring ruin. Nancy had grown up in the wilderness. She knew how to track animals, how to hunt, how to set traps, and how to defend her home. Her aim with a rifle was better than that of most men. Some neighbors whispered that she had a fierce temper. Others admired her boldness. Nancy never worried about opinions. She cared only about protecting her family and resisting those who threatened her land and her country. The war had reached even the quiet places of Georgia. British soldiers and loyalist raiders traveled through the backwoods searching for supplies and information. They burned farms, they took livestock, they frightened small communities that had little defense. Nancy had already seen too many families flee toward safer places. She refused to be one of them. One afternoon, as the sun filtered weakly through the trees, Nancy heard a series of footsteps approaching her cabin. They were heavy and uneven. Not the tread of a neighbor, not the slow shuffle of an animal. These steps carried confidence. They carried threat. Nancy set down her work and moved toward the window. She watched as several men in red coats stepped into the clearing. Their jackets were torn and dusty. Their voices were loud and careless. Nancy did not panic. She did not hide. She wiped her hands on her skirt and opened the door as they approached. Her expression remained calm even as her heart quickened. One of the soldiers stepped forward and demanded food and drink. He claimed authority over her cabin and spoke with the expectation that she would obey. Nancy kept her face steady. She invited them inside with forced politeness. They entered without hesitation, certain that a woman living alone would pose no threat. Inside the cramped room, the soldiers made themselves at home. They set their rifles against the wall. They ordered her to cook for them. Nancy moved slowly, waiting for the moment she needed. She stirred the pot on the fire and kept her eyes fixed on the men. She noted where they placed their weapons. She noted how many there were. She noted that their guard had already begun to drop. As the men argued over who should eat first, Nancy stepped toward the rifles leaning against the wall. She picked up one, then another. The soldiers turned too late. Her voice cut through the room with a command that froze them in place. She warned them not to move. Her eyes held a fire that made at least one of the men swallow hard. She ordered them to line up against the back wall. They hesitated. Nancy lifted one of the rifles and leveled it with perfect aim. The men saw the certainty in her stance and the steel in her expression. They moved. With each weapon she picked up, her confidence grew. She placed the rifles near the door where the soldiers could not reach them. One of the men made a sudden movement, perhaps believing he could overpower her. Nancy fired. The sound cracked through the cabin and echoed into the trees. The man fell, clutching his arm where the bullet struck him. The others stared at her in stunned silence. Nancy held her ground. She kept the remaining men under guard while she called out to a neighbor passing near the creek. When he arrived and saw the scene inside the cabin, his face showed both amazement and respect. Nancy ordered him to help tie the soldiers' hands. The men obeyed without argument. They knew they had been defeated by someone who possessed more strength and resolve than they had guessed. As the ropes tightened around the soldiers' wrists, Nancy kept her rifle close. She watched every movement with sharp attention. She did not relax until the men were secured and ready to be taken to the local authorities. Some versions of the story say the soldiers did not leave the cabin alive. Others say they were turned over without further harm. History holds several accounts, but all agree on one truth. Nancy Hart had captured them through her own courage and quick thinking. After the soldiers were taken away, Nancy stood at the doorway and looked out over the clearing. The sun shone through the trees in thin golden beams. The creek moved softly over the rocks. The danger had passed for the moment, but she knew others would come. The war was far from over. She stepped back inside and began cleaning her cabin, as calm as if she had just finished an ordinary task. In the weeks that followed, news of Nancy's bravery spread through the region. Neighbors spoke of her with respect. Children whispered her name as if she were a figure from legend. Even the men who had doubted her strength now praised her. Nancy, however, gave little thought to her growing reputation. She believed she had done only what any person should do when faced with danger. She had protected her home. She had stood her ground. That was enough. Years later, after the war ended and the frontier became more settled, Nancy looked back on the events of that day. She remembered the soldiers' heavy steps on the forest floor. She remembered the moment she lifted the first rifle. She remembered the feeling of calm determination that had guided her. She did not consider herself extraordinary. She considered herself prepared. Her life became a symbol of the courage found in quiet cabins and lonely clearings. She reminded people that strength could be found far from battlefields. It could be found in the hands of a woman who refused to yield to fear. It could be found in the heart of someone who understood that defending one's home was as noble as any act on the front lines of war. Nancy Hart remained in the memory of her community long after she passed. Her story became part of the history of the Revolution, not because she sought praise, but because her courage demanded remembrance. She stood against danger with steady hands and fierce resolve. She became a legend carved from the wilderness she loved. Chapter 9. Lydia Darragh. Lydia Darragh walks through the night with the message that will save American lives. The messenger who walked through the lines. The night air in occupied Philadelphia felt colder than usual, as if the city held its breath. Lamps flickered along the streets and cast long shadows against brick walls. The sound of British boots carried through the silence in short, sharp rhythms. Soldiers moved across the cobblestones with confidence. They believed the city belonged to them. Lydia Darragh knew better. She believed that courage lived quietly in the homes they passed, and she carried that courage in her own heart. Lydia stood inside her modest house on 2nd Street and listened to the footsteps of officers approaching her door. Her husband sat by the table pretending to be unmoved, but Lydia could see the worry hiding behind his calm expression. Their children had gone upstairs to bed. She placed a hand on the back of a chair to steady herself. A knock sounded at the door. Lydia opened it without hesitation. Several British officers stepped inside. Their red coats glowed in the lamplight, and their eyes carried the stern look of men who expected obedience. One officer informed her that they required her upstairs room for a private meeting. He expected her family to remain silent behind closed doors. Lydia nodded and kept her face still, though her heart tightened in her chest. After the officers climbed the stairs, she waited in the hall. The door to the meeting room remained closed, but faint voices drifted through the wooden boards. Lydia knew she should not listen. She knew the punishment for spying could be severe. Yet she also knew that her country needed every bit of information it could gather. She pressed her ear gently to the wall. The officers spoke about a secret movement planned for the coming days. They intended to march out of the city at night and surprise General Washington's troops near White Marsh. They sounded confident. They believed the Americans had no idea what was coming. Lydia realized she was the only person who could change that. After the meeting, the officers left the house and the street returned to its quiet stillness. Lydia climbed the stairs to the room they had occupied. She stood where they had stood and felt the weight of what she had heard. She prayed for courage, then returned to her family. She told her husband only what he needed to know. She would carry the rest herself. The next morning, Lydia prepared her plan. She told the British guard posted near her street that she needed to leave the city to buy flour. She carried a small bag and wrapped her cloak tight against the cold. Her voice remained steady as she spoke to the soldier, and he granted her permission to pass through the lines. He believed she posed no threat. She walked away with slow steps until she reached the edge of sight, then her pace quickened. The road out of Philadelphia felt long and empty. Trees rose on either side, bare and brittle in the winter wind. Lydia kept her head down, her thoughts focused on the message she carried. She knew she could not be caught. She knew her children depended on her return. She whispered a prayer as she walked. Hours passed before she reached the small tavern on the outskirts of the city where American scouts sometimes met. She stepped inside and found a rider warming himself by the fire. His eyes lifted when he saw her. She recognized him as a courier for the Continental Army. Lydia approached and told him she needed to speak with someone immediately. Her voice held such urgency that he nodded without question. In a quiet corner, Lydia leaned close and shared what she had heard. Her words were soft but clear. She told him about the secret march. She told him about the planned attack on White Marsh. She told him that Washington's men must be warned at once. The courier listened with wide eyes. He thanked her, bowed his head, and left the tavern at once. Lydia watched him ride into the distance and felt a wave of relief, followed by fear. Her work was only half finished. She needed to return to Philadelphia without drawing suspicion. She began her walk back, each step heavier than the last. The afternoon sun sank behind the trees. The shadows deepened. Lydia wrapped her cloak tighter and moved along the road with quiet determination. She knew the British guards might question her more closely on her return. She prepared her answers in her mind. When she reached the checkpoint, the soldiers stopped her. They examined her bag and found only the flour she had purchased. A soldier asked if she had spoken to anyone along the way. Lydia looked him in the eye and said she had gone only to buy flour and had spoken to no one else. Her voice held no tremor. The guard studied her for a moment, then waved her through. Lydia walked home slowly, keeping her breaths even until she reached her own door. When she stepped inside, she allowed her shoulders to relax for the first time that day. Her children ran to her, relieved to see her safe. She held them close and thanked God she had returned without discovery. Days later, British troops marched out of the city under cover of darkness, confident in their plan. They expected to surprise Washington's army. Instead, they found the Americans prepared. The element of surprise was gone. The British withdrew, confused by how their secret had been revealed. Only a few people ever learned that Lydia Darragh had walked through the lines with the truth hidden in her heart. Lydia returned to her quiet routines, caring for her family and running her household. She never boasted about what she had done. She never claimed praise. She lived simply with the satisfaction of knowing she had saved American lives. Her courage remained a quiet force, seen only by those who truly understood her strength. Years later, her story emerged in letters and recollections. People began to speak her name with respect. They admired the woman who had walked alone through danger for the sake of her country. They admired her steady resolve. They admired the power of her silence. Lydia Darragh showed that bravery did not always come with grand gestures. Sometimes it came from the steps of a woman walking through the night with a secret that could change the course of a battle. She taught that courage could live in the heart of any person willing to act when the moment required it. Chapter 10. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton holds the strength and kindness that shaped her life of service. Grace, loyalty, and a life of service. The winter light rested softly on the Schuyler estate in Albany. Snow covered the wide fields and settled on the branches of the tall trees that lined the property. Smoke drifted gently from the chimneys of the large house and gave the air a familiar scent of wood and warmth. Elizabeth Schuyler walked through the hallway with a calm that came from a life lived close to both duty and kindness. Her steps were soft against the wooden floor as she moved toward the front door where her father, General Philip Schuyler, stood speaking with a group of messengers. Elizabeth listened for a moment before stepping forward. She had grown up in a home where military matters were often discussed and where visitors arrived with important news. Her father was an important figure in the Continental Army, and their home served as a place of planning and gathering. Yet despite the seriousness of the times, Elizabeth carried a gentleness that seemed to soften even the coldest winter day. She stood beside her father and greeted the men with a warm smile. One of them handed General Schuyler a sealed message from General Washington. Elizabeth watched her father's expression shift as he read. She knew at once that the news carried weight. When the men left the house, she waited until her father turned toward her. He told her that a young officer named Alexander Hamilton would be visiting soon. Elizabeth felt a stir of curiosity. She knew the name. Hamilton served as an aide to General Washington and was known for his sharp mind and tireless work. She had heard her father speak of him with admiration. Still, she did not know what to expect from the meeting. Days later, Hamilton arrived at the Schuyler home, wearing a uniform dusted with snow from travel. He carried himself with confidence, but his eyes held a mixture of intensity and fatigue. Elizabeth stood near the fireplace when he entered the room. She felt her cheeks warm when he bowed and greeted her. He spoke politely, yet with a spark of energy that made her smile despite herself. During his stay, the two of them spent time talking in the parlor while the fire crackled beside them. Elizabeth listened to his stories about the army and the hope he carried for the future of the country. His words moved with quick precision. He spoke of plans and ideas. He spoke of purpose. Elizabeth admired his determination and the way he seemed to chase every challenge without fear. Hamilton, in turn, admired Elizabeth's calm presence. Her kindness steadied him. Her quiet strength gave him peace in a world filled with hurry and uncertainty. They walked together through the quiet snowfall, speaking about family and faith. He found himself drawn to the softness in her voice and the steady warmth in her eyes. Their bond grew stronger with each visit. Elizabeth knew in her heart that Hamilton carried a heavy burden in his work for the army. She sensed the weight he felt and offered him the comfort of steady listening. He often told her that her presence reminded him of what they were fighting for. She treasured his words. When they married in 1780, the war was still raging. Elizabeth moved with Hamilton as he continued his service. She managed their home with patience and care, even when their resources were limited. She tended to their children. She opened her doors to soldiers and families who needed help. Her life became one of support, stability, and unwavering loyalty. During the darkest days of the war, she wrote letters that encouraged her husband. She reminded him of the goodness that still existed in the world. She reminded him of the future they hoped to build together. Even when she felt fear for his safety, she kept her voice steady. She believed that love carried its own kind of strength. Elizabeth's devotion extended beyond her home. She visited wounded soldiers and brought them small comforts. She offered prayers beside their beds. She listened to their stories and carried their grief with compassion. She believed that service to others was a noble duty, and she lived by that belief every day. When the war finally ended, Elizabeth felt relief, but also a deep sense of responsibility. The new nation needed people who cared as deeply as her husband did. She supported his public work and encouraged him during moments of doubt. She understood that his drive came from a desire to build something lasting. She shared that desire. Years later, Elizabeth's strength would be tested when her family faced hardship and loss. She carried her pain with grace. She turned her focus to acts of kindness. She helped found an orphanage in New York City and dedicated decades of her life to caring for children who had no one else. She greeted each child with warmth and treated every one of them as if they belonged to her. The work brought her comfort and purpose. When Elizabeth looked back on her life, she understood that her legacy was shaped not only by the man she loved, but by the choices she made. She had given her heart to her family. She had given her time to her country. She had opened her arms to children who needed hope. She had lived with quiet strength and steady faith. People often spoke of the famous men of the Revolution. They spoke of generals and officers, of battles and victories. Yet those who knew Elizabeth understood that her life carried its own kind of courage. She showed that service could be gentle. She showed that loyalty could be powerful. She showed that love, lived with patience and devotion, could change the lives of many. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton's story became a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who stand in the center of battlefields, but also by those who bring warmth to the coldest moments. Her life glowed with kindness that reached far beyond her home. She became a quiet light in the early years of the nation, guiding others through her unwavering service and grace. Chapter 11. Esther de Bert Reed. With steady hands, Esther de Bert Reed guides the women who came together to comfort an army. The women who found strength in unity. Morning sunlight drifted through the tall windows of the Reed home in Philadelphia, laying soft patterns across the wooden floor. The city outside was restless with the sounds of wagons and soldiers, a constant reminder that the war edged itself into every street and square. Esther de Bert Reed stood by her writing desk, hands resting lightly on a sheet of paper. She had been awake before dawn, thinking of the men who marched in worn coats and thin shoes, men who fought with fierce spirit but carried the heavy burden of hunger and cold. Her pen waited beside the ink bottle. She lifted it and touched it to the page with a calm she did not entirely feel. Her voice, steady on paper, became a force that could travel far beyond her home. She wrote with purpose, believing deep in her heart that women had a part to play in the struggle for freedom. She believed that unity among women could lift an entire army. Esther had not been born in America. She had grown up in London and was the daughter of a merchant who admired the colonies. When she married Joseph Reed and came to Philadelphia, she found herself drawn to the spirit of the people and their belief in liberty. She embraced her new country with a devotion that surprised even her at times. She learned quickly that war asked much of everyone, not only of the men who stood on battlefields. She continued writing her appeal to the women of the city. She asked them to give what they could. She asked them to place the comfort of the soldiers above their own. She reminded them that courage could be woven into small daily acts. Her words held a gentle strength, and she hoped they would stir hearts. When she finished the letter, she read it aloud. The words spoke of shared purpose, of compassion, and of the power of women to bring hope where it was most needed. She folded the paper and sealed it, ready to send it to the printers. She did not seek attention. She sought only to help. Soon, the letter, titled Sentiments of an American Woman, spread through Philadelphia and beyond. Women read her words and felt moved. They gathered in meetings, bringing coins, cloth, candles, and whatever they could spare. Esther watched with gratitude as neighbors arrived at her door with donations held close in their hands. Some were wealthy, others barely had enough for themselves. Yet all came with a spirit of unity. The rooms of her home filled with supplies. Rolls of linen, stacks of shirts, and piles of wool gathered on her tables. Esther walked among them with a sense of awe. She saw hope in every folded piece of cloth, in every coin dropped into the collection box. She felt the strength of a community that refused to ignore the suffering of the soldiers. She organized the effort with patience and care. She visited homes. She wrote more letters. She encouraged women who felt uncertain. She praised those who gave generously. She did all of this while caring for her children and managing her household. At night, she prayed for the soldiers who would receive the gifts and for the women who had answered her call. One afternoon, she gathered the members of the Ladies' Association in her parlor. Sunlight warmed the room as the women worked together. Some cut fabric, some sewed shirts, some counted supplies. Voices rose and fell in gentle conversation. Esther moved from one group to another with a quiet smile. She felt the strongest sense of unity she had ever known. While they worked, a messenger arrived with a letter from General Washington. Esther opened it with careful hands. His words praised the women for their kindness and their remarkable effort. He wrote that the soldiers would be grateful and strengthened by the gifts. The room fell silent as Esther read the letter aloud. Some women wiped their eyes. Others clasped hands. They felt seen and valued. Esther placed the letter on the mantel where everyone could see it. She felt her heart swell with pride. She knew that her work had brought comfort to men who fought without complaint. She knew that women had the power to lift spirits and ease suffering even from far away. The months passed, and the Ladies' Association accomplished more than Esther had dreamed possible. Yet her health began to waver. She brushed off the concern of friends. She said she was only tired, but the truth was harder. She had given everything she had, and her body could no longer keep pace with her spirit. She continued working as long as she could, sitting at her desk with blankets wrapped around her shoulders. She wrote letters with slow hands. She encouraged the women around her with soft words. Even when illness kept her in bed, she asked for updates on their progress. Her devotion remained steady. When Esther passed away in the summer of 1780, the news spread through the city with heavy sorrow. The women who had followed her leadership wept for the loss of a friend and inspiration. Joseph Reed held their children close and spoke of her kindness and strength. General Washington wrote a letter offering his deepest condolences. He praised her service and the love she had shown her adopted country. In the days after her passing, the women of the city gathered again in Esther's home. They decided to continue the work she had started. They would finish the shirts, they would send gifts of comfort to the soldiers. They would honor her memory through action. Elizabeth Hamilton, who had admired Esther greatly, helped lead the remaining efforts. She brought a gentle steadiness to the group, reminding them that unity was their strength. Together, they completed the project Esther had begun. They packed the shirts in crates and sent them to the army with a prayer for the men who would wear them. Esther de Burt Reed's legacy did not fade with time. She became a symbol of the quiet power that women carried during the Revolution. She showed that leadership could flow from compassion. She showed that unity could grow from a single voice. She showed that service, offered freely, could reach farther than anyone expected. Years later, historians would write about soldiers and battles. Yet those who looked deeper found the story of a woman who rallied others with her words and her heart. They found a story of unity born from kindness. They found Esther's story and understood the courage behind it. Her life became a reminder that revolutions are shaped not only by muskets and marches, but by hands that sew and hearts that serve. She proved that when women stand together, they bring strength that carries through generations. Chapter 12, Catherine Kitty Green. Catherine Green works with patient hands as the army gathers strength around her. Hope and steadiness in a time of hardship. The morning mist lifted slowly over the rolling fields of the southern countryside. The air felt warm and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant smoke. Catherine Green stepped outside the small tent she shared with her husband, General Nathaniel Green, and watched the first line of sunlight spread across the land. She folded her arms gently, letting the warmth settle over her. She knew the day ahead would bring challenges, but she had learned to greet each one with quiet steadiness. Life beside an army was never simple. Food was scarce, clothing wore thin, and sickness traveled quickly through the camps. Catherine had seen men who once stood tall, now weakened by hunger and long marches. Yet she also saw determination in their eyes, a belief in the cause that carried them forward even when their strength faltered. Catherine walked toward the small fire that burned near the center of camp. A few soldiers sat nearby, warming their hands. She greeted them kindly and offered a soft word of encouragement. They smiled at her presence. Her voice carried comfort that felt as important as the food they hoped to eat later. Catherine believed that care and compassion could strengthen a weary heart more than anything else. Her husband moved through the camp, speaking with officers and studying maps. He carried the burden of command with quiet resolve. Catherine watched him from a distance as he spoke with the men. She knew the weight he carried. She also knew he relied on her steady presence more than he ever said aloud. As the soldiers prepared for another long day of marching, Catherine helped a young man who struggled to fasten the worn strap of his pack. She tied it securely and gave him a gentle smile. He thanked her with sincere gratitude. Catherine patted his shoulder and wished him strength. When the men set out, she walked alongside them for a short distance. She wanted them to know they were not alone. She understood the fear that hid beneath their determined steps. She had seen it in their eyes the night before when they sat around the fire telling stories of home. Catherine's heart ached for each one who missed a family waiting far away. After the soldiers disappeared into the trees, Catherine returned to the camp and began the work of tending to what remained. She washed clothing, mended tears in uniforms, and prepared what little food she could gather. She believed that small acts of care could ease the hardships of war. The Southern campaign had tested everyone connected to the army. The heat weighed heavily on the men. Supplies moved slowly over long distances, yet Catherine found strength in the quiet moments of each day. She watched the wind stir the tall grass. She listened to the evening songs of birds settling in the trees. She offered prayers for the safety of the soldiers and for her husband, who carried the responsibility of guiding them. One afternoon, as she prepared a pot of stew with what few vegetables she had, she heard footsteps behind her. Nathaniel approached with a tired smile. The lines on his face looked deeper today, and his shoulders drooped with exhaustion. Catherine placed a hand on his arm and guided him to sit beside her. She ladled a small portion of stew into a bowl and handed it to him. He accepted it gratefully and took a slow sip. He told her of the struggles they faced. He spoke of the enemy's strength and the harsh conditions of the land. Catherine listened closely without interruption. Her presence offered a peace he could not find anywhere else. When he fell silent, she placed her hand over his and held it lightly. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her touch steady him. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Catherine lit a small lantern outside the tent. Its warm glow cast a circle of light around her. She sat with a piece of cloth in her lap and continued sewing. Soldiers passed by and greeted her with quiet respect. They understood that her presence lifted the spirits of the entire camp. She finished the last stitch and set the cloth aside. She leaned back slightly and looked at the sky. The stars began to appear one by one. She whispered a prayer for the men who slept under the open sky, trusting that courage would rise with the morning light. During the next weeks, Catherine traveled with the army through the difficult terrain. She saw the toll the war took on the men. She saw their blistered feet, their tired eyes, and their worn clothing. She also saw their determination. She admired the way they continued, step after step, carrying the hope of a better future on their shoulders. One night, after a particularly grueling march, a soldier collapsed near the camp. Catherine rushed to his side and helped him drink from her small flask of water. She supported his head and spoke softly to him until his breathing steadied. He thanked her through tears. Catherine brushed his hair gently from his forehead and assured him that he was not alone. Her voice carried a compassion that eased his fear. The next morning, he found her and bowed his head in gratitude. Catherine smiled warmly and told him that kindness was simply what people owed one another. He nodded and walked away with renewed strength. Her warmth spread throughout the camp. Men spoke of her steadiness with admiration. They called her a beacon of hope in the darkest moments. Catherine did not seek such praise. She only wished to bring comfort where it was needed. When the war finally began to turn in favor of the Americans, Catherine felt a cautious sense of relief. She knew that victory would come only with continued sacrifice. She also knew that the men were weary. She doubled her efforts to care for them, preparing what little food she could and offering prayers with each meal. Years later, when she looked back on the days she spent beside the army, Catherine understood that her strength had been shaped by hardship. She believed that hope was something one chose to hold, even when the world felt uncertain. She believed that care offered to others could shine brighter than any lantern. Her life became a quiet testament to the power of compassion. She had stood beside her husband with unwavering loyalty. She had lifted spirits when fear pressed heavily on the hearts of the men. She had shown that courage could come from gentleness and that hope could thrive in the hands of a woman who believed in peace. Catherine "Kitty" Green remained a symbol of steadiness long after the war ended. Her story lived on in the memories of the soldiers she comforted and in the legacy of kindness she left behind. She proved that even in the hardest of times, hope could find a place to grow. Chapter 13. Prudence Cummings Wright. Prudence Cummings Wright stands her ground at the bridge as enemy riders approach. The guard who stopped the enemy. The early spring wind moved through the small Massachusetts town of Pepperell and carried with it the scent of thawing earth and the faint promise of warmer days. The Nashua River ran cold and quick beside the wooden bridge at the edge of town, its waters reflecting the pale morning light. The trees that bordered the road were still bare, but hints of green pushed through their branches. It was a quiet place, the kind of place where families lived simply and neighbors knew one another by name. Prudence Cummings Wright stood near the bridge with her cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders. The morning air chilled her face, but she did not mind. Her eyes remained fixed on the road that wound through the trees. She had spent many days waiting and watching like this, listening for the sound of footsteps or the distant clatter of horses. She felt the weight of responsibility rest firmly on her shoulders. The war had changed the rhythm of Pepperell. Men had marched away to join the fight for liberty, and the town felt the loss of their presence. The women who remained refused to let fear weaken them. Prudence had gathered them in her home, speaking to them with calm strength. She told them that danger could come at any moment, that the enemy might pass through their roads carrying messages that could bring harm to the men they loved. She encouraged the women to stand as guards when no one else was there to do it. The women agreed. They trusted Prudence. They believed in her courage. They believed in her ability to lead them. She chose the bridge as the place where they would keep watch. It served as the main crossing into town, and anyone traveling between Boston and the northern settlements would pass through. She told the women that they would take turns guarding the bridge, watching from the small rise in the land where they could remain hidden until needed. Prudence looked at the river as it rushed beneath the planks of the bridge. It was a familiar sound, steady and unchanging. The women began to gather behind her, each one dressed in simple, homespun clothing. They carried whatever tools or weapons they could find. Some held old muskets that had belonged to their husbands or fathers. Others carried pitchforks or long wooden poles. Their faces held a mixture of fear and determination. One woman approached Prudence and asked if she felt afraid. Prudence smiled gently and said that fear was a part of courage. Courage, she explained, was not the absence of fear, but the steady decision to act despite it. The woman nodded and stepped back into line. Prudence looked toward the road once more. She remembered the stories she had heard about others who had stood for liberty. She remembered the moment she learned that the enemy might try to move secret messages through their town. She knew that these messages could reveal the movements of the Continental Army. She knew that capturing the couriers could save lives. The women took their places. Some hid behind the trees. Others stood near the edge of the bridge. Prudence remained in the center, her posture straight, her eyes sharp and alert. She felt the wind lift her hair from her face. She felt the silence settle over the group like a thin blanket. Everyone waited. Minutes passed. Then the sound came. Hoofbeats. Slow at first, then more distinct. Prudence raised her hand and the women shifted into readiness. Two riders appeared on the road, moving with confidence toward the bridge. They wore cloaks pulled tightly around their shoulders. Their movements were purposeful. Prudence stepped forward. The riders approached the bridge and saw the women blocking their path. One of them reined in his horse and demanded to know why the bridge had been closed. Prudence met his gaze without flinching. She told him that he must dismount and show his papers. The man scoffed and tightened his grip on the reins. He seemed ready to ride through them. Prudence lifted her musket with calm precision. The other women did the same. The riders hesitated. Prudence told them once more to dismount. This time, her voice carried an authority that left no room for argument. The men climbed down from their horses slowly, casting nervous glances at the women who surrounded them. Prudence stepped forward and searched the saddlebags. She found a sealed packet of papers. She held it up to the light and saw the insignia of the British Army. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had been right. These men were carrying secret messages. The riders demanded that she return the papers. Prudence shook her head. She told them that the papers belonged to the people who fought for liberty and that she would deliver them to the proper authorities. The men threatened her, but their voices held no power. They were surrounded by women who refused to yield. The women tied the hands of the riders with lengths of rope and escorted them back toward town. Prudence walked beside them with the packet held firmly in her grasp. She felt the pride rise within her. She had done what must be done. She had protected her community. She had prevented harm from reaching the army. When they reached Pepperell, the town gathered to hear what had happened. The people stared at Prudence with admiration. She explained what they had done and why it mattered. She showed them the papers and told them that the women had acted with bravery and unity. The townspeople praised her and thanked her for her leadership. Prudence smiled humbly. She did not seek attention or honor. She believed that anyone placed in her position would have done the same. She believed that courage belonged to all who embraced their duty. In the years that followed, her story traveled far beyond the small bridge in Pepperell. People spoke of the women who had stood together and stopped the enemy. They spoke of Prudence Cummings Wright, who had guided them with a steady hand and a determined heart. Prudence grew older, but her spirit remained strong. She often walked to the bridge and listened to the river as it moved over the rocks. She remembered the silence before the riders arrived. She remembered the moment she held the packet of messages in her hand. She remembered the unity of the women who stood with her. She knew that courage took many forms. Sometimes it was found in the heart of a soldier on a battlefield. Sometimes it lived in the hands of a woman who refused to let danger pass unnoticed. She believed that bravery grew in anyone who chose to protect what mattered most. Prudence Cummings Wright left behind a legacy of steadfast strength. Her story became a reminder that even in the quiet corners of the country, the spirit of the revolution burned brightly. It showed that courage could rise in unexpected places. It showed that unity could turn ordinary women into guardians of their homes. It showed that one determined heart could change the course of events. Her name remained etched in the memory of Pepperell and in the history of the Revolution. She had stood at the bridge and faced the unknown. She had protected her community with unwavering resolve. She had proven that when danger approached, she would stand her ground. Chapter 14. Margaret Corbin. Margaret Corbin steps forward to serve the cannon after her husband falls in battle, a woman who took her place at the cannon. The morning air was crisp around Fort Washington as the sun rose above the Hudson River. A pale glow touched the tops of the trees and moved slowly across the uneven ground. Soldiers gathered near the outer walls with weary steps. Smoke from the small cooking fires drifted upward in thin ribbons. The fort, built to guard the river and the land beyond, stood like a determined but tired guardian. War had taken its toll, supplies were thin, hope flickered like the fires that warmed the men in the early light. Margaret Corbin moved through the fort with the confidence of someone who had learned to make herself useful wherever she was needed. She carried a bucket of water from the nearby well and offered it to a group of soldiers seated on the ground. Some of them smiled at her in gratitude. She nodded warmly in return. She was not formally part of the army, yet she had become a familiar presence. She had traveled with her husband, John, ever since he enlisted. She cooked for him. She washed his clothing. She helped however she could. She had grown accustomed to the rough rhythm of military life. She walked toward the cannon emplacement where her husband served. John Corbin stood with a group of artillerymen preparing the heavy gun for the day ahead. He smiled when he saw her. Margaret handed him a cup of water. He drank gratefully and brushed the back of his hand across his forehead. The air carried the growing tension of a coming battle. They both felt it. Margaret remained near the cannon. She knew the steps involved in loading it. She had watched John and the other men work many times. She understood the rhythm of it. Powder, wadding, shot, ram, aim, fire. She had seen the process repeated in training and in battle. She had helped carry water to cool the gun when it overheated. She had steadied the tools when the men grew tired. She knew that war did not wait for comfort. As the morning passed, distant sounds carried through the trees. The enemy approached. British and Hessian forces moved steadily toward the fort. Their numbers were large. Their steps were confident. The men at Fort Washington braced themselves. Margaret watched them take their positions with unspoken courage. The sun climbed higher and the first shots rang out. Smoke rose from the far side of the fort. The cannon crew moved quickly. John called out commands, his voice firm and steady. The men loaded the cannon with practiced precision. Margaret stepped back but kept her eyes fixed on the gun. She felt her heart quicken. The enemy advanced up the hill. Muskets cracked and the air filled with the thunder of cannon fire. Margaret watched the men around her move with urgency. She stepped forward to offer water. She steadied a tool that began to roll away on the uneven ground. She listened to John's voice rise above the noise. Then, the moment came. A sudden explosion tore through the smoke. A burst of musket fire swept across the cannon position. Margaret saw John fall. She felt the world narrow to a single point of fear. She ran to him and knelt beside him. He lay still. His eyes did not open. His hands did not reach for her. She placed her hand on his shoulder and felt the grief rise in her chest. The cannon crew faltered. One of the men shouted that they needed someone to take John's place. Margaret looked at the cannon, then at her husband, then at the enemy advancing through the smoke. She rose to her feet. Her grief hardened into resolve. She stepped forward and took John's position without hesitation. The men stared at her for a moment, but they could see the determination in her eyes. They moved aside. They knew she understood the steps. They knew she would not falter. She had watched them long enough to know exactly what to do. Margaret grabbed the rammer and pushed the wadding deep into the cannon's barrel. Her arms strained with the effort. The heat from the gun brushed against her skin. Her hair clung to her face. She did not stop. The men loaded the shot. Margaret rammed it into place with precision. She stepped aside as the cannon fired. The ground shook beneath her. Smoke billowed around them. The enemy pressed closer. The crew worked with renewed energy, inspired by her courage. Margaret's hands grew blistered. Her arms trembled from the repeated effort, yet she continued. Powder, shot, ram, aim, fire. Each blast pushed back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of John. She thought of the men fighting beside her. She thought of the cause they defended. She felt her heart steady with every step. The battle grew fiercer. Musket balls tore through the air. Splinters of wood flew from the fort's walls. Then another volley struck the cannon position. Margaret felt a searing pain tear through her shoulder. She stumbled, but refused to fall. She pressed her hand to the wound and forced herself upright once more. The men tried to pull her back. She shook her head. She gripped the rammer with her uninjured hand and prepared the cannon for another shot. The pain throbbed through her arm, but she ignored it. She placed herself where she needed to be. She filled the space John had left. She carried the fight forward with the strength of her whole spirit. At last, the order came to withdraw. The fort could not hold. The enemy swarmed across the walls. Margaret finally allowed the men to help her walk. They guided her to a safer place as the cannon fell silent. She looked back once at the hill and at the cannon she had served with fierce resolve. Her vision blurred, but her heart remained steady. Margaret's injury was severe. The wound left her permanently disabled, yet her bravery did not fade. She became the first woman in the new nation to receive a military pension for her service. Soldiers who had fought beside her told her story to anyone who would listen. They spoke of her strength. They spoke of her courage. They spoke of the moment she stepped forward when the world around her seemed ready to collapse. In the years that followed, Margaret carried her injury with dignity. She lived quietly, but she never forgot the day she took her husband's place at the cannon. She remembered the heat of the gun. She remembered the sound of the enemy's advance. She remembered the pride she felt when she stood for something greater than herself. Her legacy lived on in the memories of those who witnessed her bravery. She became a symbol of fierce determination. She proved that courage could come from anyone who chose to act. She showed that even in the harshest moments of war, the human spirit could rise with strength. Margaret Corbin did not seek glory. She sought only to protect her home and her country. She stood where she was needed. She fought with everything she had. Her name became a quiet tribute to the countless women who served in ways history often forgets. Chapter 15. Rachel Revere. Rachel Revere walks through the guarded streets with a message that could save lives. Courage in the heart of Boston. The city of Boston sat under a heavy silence in the spring air. British soldiers marched through its narrow streets, their boots striking the cobblestones in steady rhythm. Red coats filled the squares and alleyways, their presence a constant reminder that the city was watched from every corner. Doors opened and closed quietly. Voices dropped to careful whispers. Life continued, but every movement carried caution. Rachel Revere stood at the window of her home on North Square and watched the patrol pass. She held the curtain just enough to see without being seen. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with awareness. She had grown used to the tension that wrapped itself around her city. She had learned to move with care, to listen more than she spoke, and to stay calm even when danger brushed close. Her husband, Paul Revere, was away more often than he was home. His responsibilities grew heavier as the colonies edged closer to open conflict. Rachel managed the household in his absence. She cared for the children. She made sure the shop functioned. She listened carefully when neighbors came with news, and she carried messages when needed. She did all of this with a quiet steadiness that gave strength to those around her. Inside the house, the smell of warm bread drifted from the kitchen. One of the children laughed softly in the next room. Rachel took a long breath and let the sound soothe her. She returned to the table where she had been writing a letter. She dipped her quill into the ink and touched the tip to the paper. Her handwriting flowed in gentle lines as she described the conditions in the city. She wanted Paul to know what she knew. She wanted him to understand both the fear and the determination she saw in the people. She paused when she heard a knock at the door. She set down her quill and opened the door just enough to see who had come. A neighbor stood on the steps, his face pale with urgency. He stepped inside quickly and whispered that the British officers were preparing to make sudden moves against the Patriot leaders. He had heard them speak of arrests. He had heard them speak of a crackdown. Rachel felt the tension rise in her chest. She thanked him and closed the door. She moved through the house with purpose. She folded the letter she had been writing and sealed it. She added the message she had just received. She would send it to Paul, no matter the risk. She knew the information could keep him safe. She knew it might save others too. Rachel placed the letter inside a small pouch and tied it with cord. She tucked it inside her cloak. She prepared to leave the house, but she stopped at the doorway. She whispered a prayer for her children, then called a friend who lived nearby and asked her to watch them for a short time. Rachel wrapped the cloak around herself and stepped out into the cool evening air. Boston's streets carried a strange stillness. Lamps burned beside doorways. A few shopkeepers closed their shutters with hurried hands. Rachel walked with her head down, blending into the small clusters of people moving through the square. She held the pouch close under her cloak and kept her pace steady. She approached the wharf where small boats bobbed against the wooden docks. Water lapped softly at the pilings. The air smelled of salt and tar. She found the man who had agreed to carry messages to the mainland. He stood beside a stack of crates, pretending to adjust a rope. When Rachel approached him, he nodded slightly without looking directly at her. She removed the pouch from her cloak and handed it to him. Their eyes met for a moment. He understood the importance without needing to hear a word. He tucked the pouch under his coat and stepped aboard a small boat. Rachel watched him push off from the dock. The boat moved quietly across the darkening water, carrying her message into the uncertain night. Rachel turned and began walking home. The wind brushed against her face. She lifted her cloak to shield herself from the chill. The narrow streets curved before her. She passed a group of British soldiers standing near a tavern. One of them looked at her with suspicion. She lowered her eyes and walked calmly past them. She did not let her pace change. Inside, she felt her heart beat with urgency, but she hid it well. When she reached her home, she closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. She felt both relief and burden. She hoped the letter would reach Paul. She hoped he would understand the danger. She hoped he would stay safe. Later that night, she sat by the fire with her children gathered around her. The soft glow illuminated their faces. She read them a story, her voice steady and warm. She wanted them to feel safe, even when the world outside felt uncertain. She wanted them to know that strength lived in small comforts and in steady hearts. As the months passed, Rachel continued to live with courage in the heart of Boston. She carried messages, she gathered supplies, she kept the family business running. When Paul returned home after his famous ride, she listened as he described the night's events. She held his hands, grateful that he had returned safely. She shared what she had seen in the city. He admired her calm strength. He told her that her actions had protected him. Rachel shook her head gently. She believed that everyone did their part. She believed that courage could come from any person who acted with purpose. After the war began in full force, Rachel managed the household while Paul served in the militia and continued his work for the cause. She stayed strong for their children. She stayed strong for herself. She stayed strong for the country she believed in. Years later, when peace returned, Rachel looked back on the days of tension and danger. She remembered the knock at the door. She remembered the weight of the pouch in her cloak. She remembered walking past the soldiers who watched her with suspicion. She remembered the flicker of lamps on the wharf as her message crossed the water. She knew she had played a part in something larger than herself. She knew her courage had lived not in great battles, but in quiet acts of responsibility and faith. She believed that strength often appeared in the small moments when a person chose to do what was right. Rachel Revere became a symbol of quiet bravery. She had protected her family. She had protected her husband. She had served her city with calm resolve. She had shown that even under the watchful eyes of an occupying force, courage could thrive in the heart of a woman who walked with purpose. Chapter 16, Sally St. Clair. Sally St. Clair sits in uniform, holding the secret she carried into battle. A life hidden in uniform. The heat of the southern sun hung heavy over the Carolina wilderness. The air shimmered above the ground, and the cry of insects echoed through the tall grasses. Soldiers moved slowly along the dusty road, their uniforms darkened with sweat and wear. Muskets rested across their shoulders, and their steps carried the weight of exhaustion and determination. Among them marched a soldier whose gait was steady but light, a young recruit who kept to the center of the column and rarely spoke. The name on the company rolls was St. Clair. To the men around this soldier, St. Clair was simply another recruit who had joined the cause. Quiet, focused, capable. Someone who followed orders without complaint and worked harder than many. Someone who kept a cap pulled low and never undressed near the others. Someone who guarded a private world that no one else thought to question. Beneath the uniform, hidden by cloth and caution, lived the truth that only one person carried. St. Clair was not a young man at all. St. Clair was Sally St. Clair, a woman who had chosen a life of secrecy to stay near the man she loved. She had grown up hearing stories of bravery and sacrifice. When the war carried her beloved into the army, she refused to remain behind. She cut her hair. She secured the loose fabric of the uniform. She learned to move as the men did. She chose a new name and stepped into a world that belonged to them. Sally marched with discipline. She shouldered her musket with precision. She slept on the hard ground under the open sky. She followed the long routes through swamps and forests. She faced hunger and heat, cold and rain. She blended into the rough rhythm of soldier life with such care that no one suspected her secret. The Southern campaign was harsh, supplies were low, the terrain was unforgiving. General Greene's men fought battle after battle, often outnumbered and outmatched. Sally watched the men around her draw on their last reserves of strength. She heard them whisper the names of the families they hoped to return to. She carried her own hope quietly in her heart. In the evenings, she sat alone by the fire, polishing her musket and listening to the laughter of the men. They did not know her story, yet she felt connected to them. They shared the same danger. They endured the same hardship. They followed the same cause. When they joked or sang, she allowed herself a small smile. It felt good to belong, even if only in the shadows of secrecy. Sally fought her first skirmish with a calm that surprised her. The sound of musket fire cracked through the trees. She lifted her weapon and fired with steady aim. The smoke curled around her face. Fear raced through her chest, but she held her ground. When the battle ended, the men spoke of her bravery. She nodded quietly and returned to her place in line. With each passing month, the risks grew. The British pressed harder. The fighting became more desperate. The soldiers sensed that the outcome of the war might turn on the struggles in the South. Sally felt the tension rise in the air like a storm building above them. One afternoon, as the army moved through a narrow stretch of wooded swamp, the air grew still. The men sensed danger before they heard it. A sudden volley of musket fire burst from the trees. The enemy had ambushed them. Soldiers scrambled for cover. Commands echoed in every direction. Sally gripped her musket and moved into position beside her company. The trees exploded with movement. Smoke drifted through the branches. Sally loaded and fired again. The noise shook the air around her. She pushed through her fear and focused only on the next action. Powder, shot, ram, fire. Her shoulder throbbed from the recoil. Her hands moved with practiced skill. As the skirmish intensified, Sally stepped forward to fill a gap in the line. Men around her fell, wounded or exhausted. She moved quickly to support them. She lifted her musket and aimed once more. Then came the moment that changed everything. A sharp burst of pain struck her side. The force knocked her to the ground. She gasped as the world blurred above her. Soldiers rushed past her, shouting orders and firing into the trees. Sally tried to lift herself, but the pain spread through her body. She pressed her hand against the wound and felt the warmth of her own blood. A fellow soldier knelt beside her. He called her name. She tried to speak, but only breath came. He lifted her gently, cradling her against the ground. Her cap fell back, exposing her face fully. The soldier froze. The truth revealed itself in the shape of her features and the softness of her jaw. He stared at her in stunned silence. Another man joined him. They shifted Sally carefully. One of them whispered a prayer. When her shirt tore open from the wound, the full truth became undeniable. Shock spread through the men around her. She was not the comrade they had marched beside. She was a woman who had hidden her identity to fight with them. They carried her to a sheltered place beneath the trees. Her breathing grew shallow. The world dimmed around her. The man she loved arrived too late to speak with her, but he held her hand until the final breath left her. The soldiers buried her near the place where she had fallen. They marked her grave with care. Some wept quietly. Others touched the fresh mound of earth with trembling hands. They spoke of her courage. They spoke of the strength she had shown. They spoke of the love that had fueled her choice to join them. Word of her story spread through the ranks. Men who had marched beside her struggled to accept that they had not seen the truth. They admired her devotion. They honored her sacrifice. General Greene himself heard of the woman who had fought and died in his campaign. He praised her bravery and the dedication she had shown. Sally's story lived on in the memories of the men who had known her as a soldier. They remembered her as someone who had stood with them without hesitation, someone who had walked the same miles, someone who had faced the same danger, someone who had fought with the same heart. Her life became a quiet symbol of love and sacrifice. She showed that courage could come from the deepest corners of the human heart. She proved that a person who chose to give everything for another could rise to moments of extraordinary strength. Sally St. Clair left behind no letters or journals. She left behind no portraits or records. Yet her story survived because those who witnessed her bravery could not forget it. She became a reminder that true devotion sometimes hides itself in the simplest of actions. She became a testament to the power of a hidden life lived with purpose. Her legacy remained in the hearts of the soldiers who had walked beside her. They carried her memory forward as a tribute to the courage she had shown. Sally St. Clair became more than a soldier. She became a symbol of love's quiet strength and of the sacrifice that shapes the deepest stories of a nation. Chapter 17. Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman. Elizabeth Freeman stands with the calm strength that helped bring freedom to her state. A fight for freedom that changed a state. The hills of western Massachusetts held a quiet beauty in the soft morning light. Mist rose from the meadows and drifted along the edges of the woods. Birds called from the branches above. A gentle breeze carried the scent of earth and early summer. Elizabeth Freeman rose before sunrise, as she had done almost every day of her life. She walked across the yard of the Ashley household with a steady grace that came from years of labor. Her hands were strong from work. Her eyes were sharp with awareness. Her spirit, however, carried something deeper than any task required of her. To most who lived nearby, she was known as Mumbet, a name that had followed her through years of enslavement. She belonged, by law, to the Ashley family. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the garden, she cared for the children, she obeyed when commanded. But inside her heart rested a quiet truth. She believed she deserved more than a life shaped by the will of others. She believed that freedom was not a gift for some, but a right for all. On this morning, she tended the fire in the kitchen hearth. Sparks rose upward as she added wood to the flames. The warmth spread through the room. She prepared bread dough with strong hands. She listened to the creak of the house and the muffled footsteps above. She had lived here long enough to know every sound. She paused only when she heard the harsh voice of Mrs. Ashley speaking to one of the other enslaved women. The tone was sharp. Mumbet knew the sound well. It reminded her of the long years she had endured without complaint. Yet something inside her had begun to shift. The world beyond the Ashley home was changing. People spoke quietly of liberty. They spoke of rights. They spoke of the promise written into the new Massachusetts Constitution. She had listened carefully to those words. All men are born free and equal. She let the words settle in her heart like glowing embers. She repeated them to herself until they felt like her own. One evening, she overheard a gathering in the Ashley home. Mr. Ashley and several men discussed the new laws. Their voices carried through the house as they read aloud from the Constitution. Mumbet paused outside the door and listened. The words struck her deeply. She believed those words applied to her as much as to anyone else. She believed that no one should hold power over another by birth. The next morning, she approached a neighbor named Attorney Theodore Sedgwick. She had heard he believed in liberty. She stood before him with calm strength. She told him she wanted to sue for her freedom. He looked at her with surprise. Few had ever heard such a request from a woman in her position, but Mumbet spoke with clear conviction. She said she wanted her life to belong to herself. She said she wanted the law to recognize her as a free woman. Sedgwick agreed to help her. He believed that her case could test the meaning of the new Constitution. Mumbet felt hope rise in her chest for the first time in many years. She returned to the Ashley household and continued her work, but she walked with a new steadiness. Her decision had been made. Her path, though uncertain, felt right. When word reached the Ashleys that Mumbet had filed suit, anger spread through the household. They threatened her. They warned her of consequences. But Mumbet did not retreat. She held her head high and looked them in the eye. She told them she had served them faithfully. She told them she had worked hard. She told them she would stand before the court and speak the truth. They could not take her spirit even if they had taken her labor. During the weeks before the trial, she continued to prepare meals and tend to the chores, but her mind often returned to the words she had heard. All men are born free and equal. She believed that someday the world would understand those words in their fullness. The day of the trial arrived with bright sunlight spilling across the Berkshire Hills. Mumbet traveled to the courthouse in Great Barrington. People gathered along the road, curious to see the woman who dared to challenge the meaning of freedom. She walked with dignity, her posture straight, her face calm. Inside the courtroom, she sat beside Sedgwick and listened as the case unfolded. Sedgwick argued that if all men were born free and equal, then no person in Massachusetts could be held as property. The Ashley family claimed otherwise. They believed the law did not apply to those enslaved. The courtroom fell silent as both sides presented their arguments. Then the judge asked if Mumbet wished to speak. She rose slowly and faced the men seated at the bench. Her voice remained steady. She told them she had served the Ashley family for many years. She told them she had worked as hard as any person could. She told them that she had never chosen that life. She told them she believed she was as deserving of liberty as any man or woman in the state. She spoke with dignity and purpose, and her words carried a truth that could not be denied. When she finished, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. The judge looked at her with respect. The men around her sensed that they had witnessed something rare. They had heard a voice that spoke not only for itself, but for many who had never been allowed to speak at all. After deliberation, the court declared that Mumbet was free. The decision echoed through the town and spread across Massachusetts. Other enslaved people heard the news and sought freedom through the courts. The ruling became a turning point. It helped bring an end to slavery in the state. Mumbet's courage had changed the law. Her voice had changed the future. When she left the courthouse, she stepped into the sunlight with tears in her eyes. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight lift from her chest. She walked away from the building with a sense of peace she had never known. She chose a new name for herself. She became Elizabeth Freeman, a name that honored her victory and her dignity. Elizabeth went on to work for the Sedgwick family as a paid servant. She cared for their children and managed the household with gentle authority. They loved her and treated her with deep respect. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had claimed her life. She saved her earnings and bought her own home. She created a life shaped by her own choices. Years later, when she reflected on her journey, she believed that freedom was worth every challenge she had faced. She believed that every person carried the right to choose their path. She believed that courage lived in the hearts of those willing to speak the truth. Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman became a symbol of strength for generations to come. Her story stood as a reminder that one person's bravery could change laws. Her life showed that even the quietest voice could rise with enough power to shape history. She walked through the world with the grace of someone who knew her worth. She shared her wisdom with those who sought her counsel. She lived with dignity until the end of her long life. When she passed away, she was laid to rest in the Sedgwick family cemetery, the only person not of their blood to be honored there. Her gravestone bore a simple truth. She could not read or write, yet she had understood the value of liberty more deeply than most. Elizabeth Freeman proved that a single step toward justice could open a path for many. Her courage helped change a state. Her spirit helped change a nation. Lucy Terry Prince. Lucy Terry Prince stands with the voice that carried her people's stories across generations. The voice who spoke for her people. The early morning sun rose slowly over the meadows of Deerfield, casting long beams of gold across the tall grass. The air held the quiet of a world waking gently from the night. Birds circled overhead, and the sound of running water from a nearby brook filled the stillness. Lucy Terry Prince stood at the edge of the field and closed her eyes for a moment. She listened to the sounds she had known since her youth. The land, the wind, the rustle of trees, all of it formed a music that lived within her. She carried those sounds in her memory and in her voice. They shaped the words she would one day speak with courage. Lucy had not been born into the calm of these meadows. She had come to Deerfield by force as a child, taken from her homeland across an ocean she could never return to. She arrived in New England as property, sold to a family in town. Yet even in that life, she found ways to hold her spirit close. She watched the world around her with sharp eyes and listened with a mind that remembered everything it heard. She learned English quickly and kept stories in her heart. She understood pain and fear, but she also understood strength. One warm summer day, when Lucy was still young, a group of settlers from the town traveled toward the meadows to gather berries. Their laughter carried across the fields. They did not sense danger. Lucy remembered the horror that followed. Native warriors attacked from the woods, and the calm of the morning shattered into cries and gunfire. The settlers ran in fear, but several fell in the chaos. Lucy watched the grief that filled the town in the days that followed. She felt the pain of the families. She let those emotions settle into her memory. From that tragedy, she created something that would outlive her. She formed a poem, the earliest known from an African American voice in the English colonies. She titled it Bar's Fight. She spoke the words before neighbors and friends. The town remembered her poem long after the wounds of the attack began to heal. Her voice captured the sorrow and the fear. It honored the lives lost. It became a part of local memory, passed down for generations by people who never knew her personally. Lucy learned early that words had power. She carried that truth into the years ahead. As she grew older, she married a free black man named Abijah Prince. Through his service in the 7 Years' War, he had earned both freedom and land. With him, Lucy found a life defined not by ownership, but by partnership. They built a home in Vermont and created a family. Their children grew under Lucy's guidance, learning respect, faith, and discipline. The land was rough and the winters were harsh, but the princes worked with determination. They built a life of dignity and purpose. Yet freedom did not bring ease. The princes often faced hostility from neighbors who resented their success. Local officials challenged their right to own land. Others tried to intimidate them. Lucy refused to bend. When a neighbor trespassed or threatened them, she spoke with a firm and unwavering voice. She petitioned town leaders with clear arguments. She confronted those who tried to harm her family. Her strength became known throughout the region. In one well-remembered moment, she argued a case before the Governing Council of Vermont. A lawyer attempted to speak over her. Lucy waited until the room grew silent and then addressed the council with such clarity that they ruled in her favor. People said afterward that her speech was more powerful than any trained lawyer's. They also said she had spoken with a grace and intelligence that commanded respect. Lucy believed that the truth carried its own authority. She trusted her voice and the force of her conviction. Her courage grew from a lifetime of enduring hardship with dignity. She had survived enslavement. She had survived loss. She had survived the cruelty of those who believed she did not belong. She used her voice to defend her rights and the rights of her children. She used her voice to challenge those who underestimated her. She used her voice to remind people that every person carried worth. In her later years, Lucy became known as a storyteller. Children gathered at her feet to listen as she spoke about the early days of Deerfield. Adults listened to her memories of conflicts and survival. She spoke of the attack that had inspired Bar's fight. She spoke of the early settlers and the dangers they faced. She spoke with humor and wisdom. People traveled to hear her stories. Her mind remained sharp even as her hair grew silver. She became a living memory of the past, a keeper of history. Neighbors who once doubted her began to admire her. They saw her resilience. They saw the love she carried for her family. They saw the gentle authority she held in her voice. Lucy walked through the town with a calm confidence that made others turn their heads. She had carved a place for herself and for her children in a world that had tried to deny her both. Her home in Vermont became a place of learning and strength. She taught her children to speak their minds. She taught them to stand tall. She taught them to honor the truth. They carried her lessons into their own lives, becoming leaders and respected members of their community. Lucy knew that legacy mattered. She understood that future generations depended on the example she set. As she grew older, she spent more time near the fire, telling stories with a soft smile. She remembered the faces of those who had passed. She remembered the land that changed with each season. She remembered the words she had spoken as a young woman that had carried across time. She believed that the world was shaped by voices that dared to speak. She believed that courage began with a single word. When Lucy Prince passed away at nearly 100 years old, the community mourned deeply. They honored her as a woman of wisdom, courage, and unwavering strength. They remembered her poem. They remembered her arguments before the council. They remembered her stories. They remembered her spirit. Her legacy lived on in the records of the town and in the memories of those who heard her speak. Her voice, once born in sorrow, became a lasting symbol of resilience. She had spoken for her people. She had spoken for truth. She had spoken with a heart shaped by hardship and hope. Lucy Terry Prince proved that a voice could rise from bondage and reach into history. She showed that a single poem could carry the weight of a community's grief. She showed that courage spoke in many forms. Her life became a testament to the power of words, the strength of memory, and the quiet authority of a woman who refused to be silenced. Chapter 19. Mary Lindley Murray. Mary Lindley Murray offers her table with a calm that slows the British officers in their pursuit. Hospitality that saved a retreat. Morning light spread across the hills above Manhattan as the mist rolled gently away from the tall grass. The September air felt cool and heavy with the scent of autumn. From her home at Murray Hill, Mary Lindley Murray stepped onto the wide porch and looked toward the distant harbor. The sky glowed with soft color, but the day carried a tension she could feel in her chest. The British Army had moved into New York. The Americans were retreating north. Danger crept closer with each passing hour. Mary drew her shawl around her shoulders and took a slow breath. She had always been known for her kindness and calm. People admired her gentle humor, her soft voice, and her gracious manners. Yet beneath that surface lived a mind sharp enough to read danger and opportunity. She was a devoted Quaker woman who treasured peace. She also understood what courage looked like when the time came to show it. She walked inside to prepare the morning meal. Her daughters moved quietly around the kitchen, setting bread on the table and heating milk in a small pot. Mary listened to the distant sound of drums echoing across the land. The British were marching. Their boots struck the earth in steady rhythm. She knew they would pass her home. She knew the American troops needed every precious moment to escape further north. A servant hurried in with the news she expected. British officers were approaching the hill. Mary placed her hands on the table and steadied herself. She understood that whatever happened next would depend on her own calmness. She instructed her daughters to prepare refreshments. Bread, cooled cider, fresh cakes. She asked for her best china to be brought out. Her daughters looked at her with surprise. She simply nodded. Outside, the clatter of horses grew louder. British General William Tryon and several officers rode toward the house. Their red coats gleamed in the sunlight. Their voices rose with commanding confidence. They believed themselves the masters of the land now. Mary watched from the window as they approached the door. She smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and stepped forward with perfect composure. When she opened the door, she greeted them with warm hospitality. Her voice held a gentle melody that made men lower their shoulders and soften their expressions. She invited the officers to rest from their long ride. They accepted eagerly, flattered by the graciousness of the invitation. Mary guided them to the long table where the cider glowed in the light and the bread still steamed from the hearth. The officers removed their gloves and took their seats. They began to speak of their plans. They boasted that their soldiers would soon catch the fleeing Americans. They laughed at the idea of the Continental Army escaping their grasp. Mary stood at the end of the table, her face peaceful, her hands folded before her. She listened with polite interest, asking small questions that encouraged them to speak even more. As the officers talked, Mary's daughters served refreshment after refreshment. The British men grew comfortable and pleased. They lingered, enjoying the rare moment of ease. The minutes passed. Each one mattered. Each one gave Washington's troops the time they desperately needed to slip northward toward safety at Harlem Heights. Mary kept her voice soft and pleasant. She nodded at the officers' stories. She asked how their journey had been. She smiled at their jokes. She made no mention of the American retreat. She simply let the moment stretch, minute after minute, until nearly half an hour had passed. Outside, British soldiers shifted impatiently, waiting for their leaders to continue the chase. They watched the windows and wondered what kept the officers inside. But Mary's hospitality held them in place as firmly as any barricade could have. At last, one of the officers rose from his seat and thanked her for her kindness. The others followed, straightening their coats and taking their hats in hand. Mary curtsied with perfect grace. She wished them a peaceful journey. They bowed in return, having no idea what her quiet generosity had accomplished. When they mounted their horses and rode away, Mary watched them disappear down the road. A long breath escaped her lips, one she had held for too long. She closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. Her daughters rushed to her side. She smiled at them gently. They all understood what had happened. They all understood what it meant. Hours later, news reached the Murray household. Washington's troops had reached safety. They had avoided the trap the British had set for them. They had lived to fight another day. And though no battlefield recorded her name, Mary Lindley Murray had played her part in saving them. Word of her bravery traveled quietly through Patriot circles. Those who knew what she had done praised her with admiration. They spoke of the Quaker woman whose hospitality had slowed an army. They spoke of the calm courage that came from a heart devoted to peace. They understood that the revolution needed many kinds of bravery. Some fought with muskets, some fought with strategy, some fought with simple acts of compassion that shifted the course of events. Mary's home remained a refuge through the troubled years that followed. She welcomed neighbors, family, and travelers with the same gentleness she had shown the officers. She tended the sick. She comforted the frightened. She kept her faith even when uncertainty shadowed the land. Her steady presence became a source of strength for those around her. In the quiet of later years, Mary walked the grounds of Murray Hill with a peaceful smile. She remembered the day the officers arrived. She remembered the sound of their laughter. She remembered the cool weight of the cider pitcher in her hand. She remembered the knowledge that her actions, though small on the surface, held the power to change lives. Mary Lindley Murray's story lived on not through loud proclamations, but through grateful whispers. People told it to children sitting by the fire. They told it during gatherings in warm kitchens and under the shade of summer trees. They told it with pride and gratitude. Her story became a tapestry woven into the fabric of the Revolution. She showed that courage did not always look like battle. Sometimes it looked like a woman standing at the head of a table, offering kindness at the very moment when danger pressed close. Sometimes it looked like choosing grace when fear might have ruled the day. Mary proved that one simple act of hospitality could shape the path of an entire retreat. She remained a symbol of gentle strength. She remained a reminder that every voice, every hand, every heart could help build a nation. Her life touched the future in ways she could never have imagined. She changed the course of a moment. She helped save the men who would lead the fight for liberty. Mary Lindley Murray lived her days with peace in her heart and courage in her actions. Her story continues to shine with quiet brilliance, carried forward by a nation that still remembers the woman whose kindness helped save an army. Chapter 20. Hannah Arnett. Hannah Arnett refuses to be silenced as she speaks the truth that her community needs to hear. The woman who would not be silenced. The winter wind moved through the streets of Elizabethtown with a sharpness that carried the sound of distant footsteps along the frozen ground. Snow rested beside fences and gathered in soft drifts near the corners of the meeting house. Chimneys sent thin columns of smoke into the pale afternoon sky. Inside one of the town's modest homes, Hannah Arnett stood near the window and watched as men hurried along the road, their coats wrapped tightly against the cold. She knew the reason for their haste. She had heard the whispering voices. She had seen the fearful glances exchanged between neighbors. The British had taken nearby towns. Loyalist sympathizers moved boldly now, hoping to reclaim influence. Some of the men in Elizabethtown felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on their resolve. They wondered if the cause of liberty had already failed. They feared that continued resistance would bring ruin to their families. Hannah understood their fears, but she also understood something greater. She knew that the struggle for independence demanded more than comfort. It demanded courage that could withstand loss. It demanded loyalty that could survive hardship. She believed deeply in the cause. She believed that surrender was a betrayal of everything they had fought for. Inside the small parlor of her home, a group of local men gathered. They removed their hats, stomped the snow from their boots, and took places around the fire. Among them stood her husband, Isaac Arnett, a man she loved dearly. His face carried the same worry she had seen in many others lately. Hannah placed a pot of warm tea on the table and greeted them all with quiet respect. The men began to talk in low voices. One of them spoke of the British victories. Another spoke of farms destroyed and families displaced. A third suggested that perhaps they should sign the Pledge of Loyalty to the Crown. Such a pledge would keep them safe, he argued. It would prevent their homes from being burned. It would spare their wives and children from suffering. Isaac listened with a troubled expression. Hannah felt her heart tighten. She moved closer to the doorway and listened. The men's voices rose. Some insisted that surrender was the sensible path. They said the war was lost. They said the dream of liberty had been foolish. They said peace could only come through submission. Hannah could no longer remain silent. She stepped into the room, her posture tall and her eyes fierce with conviction. The men turned toward her in surprise. They had not expected her to join their conversation. They certainly had not expected what she would say next. She told them that safety purchased through betrayal was not safety at all. She told them that liberty demanded sacrifice. She told them that the men who had marched away from their homes had trusted the people remaining behind to support their cause. She reminded them that the suffering of the moment could not erase the promise of a better future. Her voice rose with emotion. She spoke of families who had already lost husbands and sons. She spoke of the courage shown by farmers and laborers who had taken up arms for freedom. She spoke of the shame that would follow those who abandoned the cause when it needed them most. One of the men told her gently that women did not understand the burden of war. Another said she should return to her duties. Isaac stepped forward as if to calm her, but Hannah lifted her hand and continued speaking. The firelight flickered against her face. Her determination filled the room like a rising flame. She told them that loyalty mattered. She told them that honor mattered. She told them that surrender would stain their names for generations. She asked how they could look into the eyes of their children and say they had abandoned the fight at the hour of greatest need. The room fell silent. The men stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Hannah felt her breath quicken. She loved her husband, but she loved her country too. She told Isaac that if he chose to sign the loyalty pledge, he would not return to her home. She said she could not live beside someone who would abandon the principles that shaped their life together. The men looked from Hannah to Isaac. The silence grew heavy. Isaac's face softened with realization. He understood the depth of her conviction. He understood that her loyalty to him came from the same place as her loyalty to freedom. He placed his hand over his heart and looked at the others. He told them he would not sign. One by one, the men lowered their heads. Shame and reflection filled their eyes. Hannah's words had reached something within them that fear had smothered. They stepped outside into the cold air with renewed resolve. The meeting ended not with surrender, but with a strengthened commitment to the cause of liberty. Days later, word spread through the town that Hannah Arnett had turned back a tide of doubt with nothing but her voice and her unyielding will. People marveled at her courage. They spoke of her with admiration. They understood that her actions had helped preserve the spirit of resistance in a community on the brink of collapse. Hannah continued her work as she always had. She tended her home. She cared for her family. She offered comfort to neighbors who struggled. She prayed for the safety of the men who fought. She lived with the quiet strength of a woman who believed deeply in the power of conviction. Years later, when peace returned and independence became reality, the people of Elizabethtown remembered Hannah's courage. They spoke of the day she refused to let fear silence her. They spoke of the moment she reminded their leaders that liberty required steadfast hearts. Hannah Arnett never sought glory. She never claimed praise. She believed simply that truth should be spoken when it mattered most. Her voice carried the weight of that truth on a winter afternoon when others had grown weary. She proved that the power of conviction could change the course of a community. She proved that one determined woman could turn despair into resolve. Her legacy remained long after her voice faded. She stood as a reminder that every fight for freedom needs the courage of those who refuse to be silent. She became a symbol of strength for her town and for the country that emerged from hardship with new hope. Hannah Arnett will always be remembered as the woman who would not be silenced. Her story continues to inspire those who believe that conviction, spoken with clarity and heart, can shape the future. Chapter 21, Rebecca Bruton Mott. With calm resolve, Rebecca Bruton Mott gives what she must to help secure victory. A sacrifice that helped win a battle. The morning sun rose slowly over the fields surrounding Fort Mott, casting warm light across the tall grass that swayed gently in the spring wind. The scent of earth and blooming plants drifted through the air. Birds called from the treetops. Yet beneath the beauty of the South Carolina countryside lived a tense stillness. The war had reached the Mott plantation. British soldiers occupied the grand house at the top of the hill. American forces waited in the woods below, preparing for the moment when the battle would begin. Rebecca Bruton Mott stood at the window of a smaller outbuilding where she had taken refuge. Her eyes traced the lines of her own home, which now served as a British stronghold. The red-coated soldiers moved across the porch with rifles slung over their shoulders. They believed themselves secure behind the wooden walls and the earthworks surrounding the house. They believed they controlled the land and the people upon it. Rebecca watched them with calm strength. She felt the weight of loss, yet she carried herself with dignity. She had suffered much already in this war. The British had taken her treasured belongings in Charleston when the city fell. Her fortune had been seized, her family scattered. Yet through every hardship she held firm to her belief in the American cause. She had given her heart and her loyalty to the dream of a free nation. Outside her window, she saw movement in the trees. Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and General Henry Lee had positioned their troops for the coming assault. They needed to drive the British from her home. The location was too vital to remain in enemy hands. Yet they hesitated. The house provided strong cover for the British. An attack could last for days. Lives could be lost. Time could be wasted. Marion and Lee knew that something more drastic might be required. Shortly before noon, Marian and Lee came to speak with Rebecca. They approached with solemn expressions, their boots coated in dust from the long campaign. She welcomed them with quiet grace. They removed their hats, and for a moment the room held a silence filled with unspoken respect. Marian explained the situation. The house was too strong. The British would not surrender easily. Their forces were limited. The only way to dislodge the enemy quickly would be to set fire to the roof. The flames would force the British out. The Americans could capture the fort before reinforcements arrived. Rebecca listened without looking away. She understood at once what the officers could not bring themselves to ask. To save the land, to advance the cause, her home would have to burn. The house that held her memories, the house she had cared for, the house she had built into a place of family and hospitality. She turned her eyes back toward the window and studied its familiar shape. Marian hesitated, then spoke with quiet regret. He told her that he could not order such a destruction without her blessing. It was her property. It was her legacy. He asked if she would allow them to burn it. Rebecca looked at the officers with a calm that surprised even them. Her voice did not tremble. She told them that the cause of freedom mattered more than her house. She said that every sacrifice she had already made had been for the good of the country. She said that she would willingly give this last piece of her life if it would help secure victory. Then she did something that remained in memory long after the battle ended. She opened a chest near her bed, reached inside, and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth. From it, she revealed arrows tipped with flaming pitch, ammunition she had received from friends in exchange for food during the siege of Charleston. She placed the arrows gently in Marian's hands. She told him these were meant for defeating the British and that he should use them now. Marian and Lee looked at her with deep respect. Her courage moved them. They thanked her quietly and returned to their troops. Rebecca watched them go with her head held high. She knew that the moment of sacrifice had arrived. The American soldiers prepared the arrows. The archers stepped forward, their bows taut. They aimed at the roof of the Mott house. The sunlight glinted off the arrowheads. Then, in a single motion, they released. The arrows flew in graceful arcs and struck the thatched roof. Flames ignited at once. Smoke curled upward, darkening the bright spring sky. Rebecca stood outside and watched. The fire spread quickly along the dried straw. Orange light flickered along the roofline. Heat shimmered in the air. British soldiers inside shouted in confusion. They realized too late what was happening. They fled the burning house, rushing from doorways and windows as the flames grew hotter and the smoke thickened. The moment they reached the yard, American troops surged forward. Marian's men moved with practiced precision. The British, disoriented and unprepared, surrendered quickly. The battle ended in moments. The fort was taken. Not a single American life was lost in the charge. Rebecca remained still as the flames consumed the roof and spread down the walls. She felt the heat against her skin. She breathed the scent of smoke and burning timber. She let the moment settle in her heart. She knew she had chosen correctly. She knew that her sacrifice had served a purpose greater than her own comfort. After the battle, Marian and Lee returned to her side. They offered their deepest thanks. They promised that history would remember her bravery. Rebecca smiled with quiet sadness and said that she had done only what any patriot should do when asked to serve the cause of liberty. Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who understood the value of sacrifice. Neighbors who heard the story admired her courage. They spoke of her generosity. They spoke of her strength. They spoke of the moment she placed the flaming arrows in Marian's hands. Her name became woven into the stories of the Southern campaign. She remained a symbol of devotion to the cause of independence. Rebecca rebuilt her life with the same resilience she had shown during the war. She opened her home to family and friends, creating warmth and comfort wherever she lived. She never regretted the loss of Fort Mott. She believed that the freedom of a nation was worth more than any single home. Years later, when peace covered the land like a new dawn, people remembered Rebecca Bruton Mott. They recalled the fire that rose from her roof. They recalled the sacrifice she made. They recalled her calm face as she watched the flames and heard the surrender of the enemy. She proved that courage did not always involve the battlefield. Sometimes it came from the strength of a woman willing to give everything she had for the vision of a free future. She became a quiet hero of the Revolution, her story carried forward in gratitude and respect. Rebecca Bruton Mott stands in history as a reminder that one act of selfless sacrifice can help turn the tide of a war. She offered her home, her memories, her comfort, all for the sake of liberty. Her spirit lives on in the nation she helped to build. Chapter 22, Elizabeth Zane. Elizabeth Zane runs with the powder that will save the defenders of Fort Henry. A run for gunpowder that saved a fort. The sun hung low over the edge of the Ohio frontier, casting a warm glow over the wooden palisades of Fort Henry. The tall logs, sharpened at the top, stood like a line of guardians against the wilderness beyond. Inside the walls, children played quietly near cabins while soldiers prepared their muskets for the night ahead. Smoke rose from cook fires and drifted toward the sky in gray spirals. The people of the fort carried on with the business of living, even as danger pressed close along the forest's shadowed edge. Elizabeth Zane moved through the small settlement with a calm grace. Her long skirts brushed against the worn earth as she walked from cabin to cabin. She helped her sister grind corn, tended to the children who clung to her skirts, and listened for the familiar calls of her brothers. She had grown up in this place, surrounded by the sounds of the frontier, where danger could arrive without warning and courage was often the only defense people had. As evening approached, the sound of distant gunfire shattered the peaceful rhythm of the fort. The settlers looked toward the trees and saw movement among the shadows. A large force of warriors loyal to the British had surrounded the settlement. The attackers shouted war cries that echoed through the valley. Families ran toward the safety of the fort, clutching what they could carry. Elizabeth moved with them, guiding children inside and making sure no one was left behind. Once the gate closed, the men rushed to reinforce the walls. Muskets were loaded, ammunition was hauled to the firing positions. Women gathered in the center of the fort, helping to prepare bandages and water. Elizabeth joined them, her calm presence steadying those around her. The first shots from the attackers struck the palisade with a sharp thud. The defenders returned fire. Smoke curled above the fort, filling the air with the smell of powder. The battle had begun. Inside one of the cabins sat a barrel of precious gunpowder. It had been stored there for safety earlier in the season. Everyone in the settlement knew how important that powder was. Without it, the defenders could not fire their muskets. Without it, the fort would fall. As the battle stretched into the afternoon, the men worked tirelessly to hold the walls. They fired in steady rhythm, ducked behind cover, and reloaded their muskets with trembling hands. Their voices grew hoarse from shouting commands. The attackers pressed closer, sending volleys of musket balls and flaming arrows toward the wooden walls. The settlers fought with everything they had. Then came the moment that sent fear through every heart. The powder supply at the firing positions had nearly run out. The men looked at one another with grim realization. To continue fighting, they needed more powder. The only full supply sat in the cabin outside the fort's main wall, a building that once stood as part of the settlement before the attack forced everyone to retreat to the central stronghold. The cabin lay only a few hundred yards outside the gate, but the ground between was fully exposed to enemy fire. No one could reach it without crossing that deadly space. The men spoke of the risk. They knew that anyone who attempted the run would almost certainly be killed. They needed someone fast, someone brave, someone steady. Elizabeth listened from where she stood near the doorway, her heart beat with fierce clarity. She understood the stakes. She understood that without powder, the fort could not survive. She stepped forward and told the men she would make the run. The room fell silent. The men stared at her in disbelief. They told her it was too dangerous. They told her she must stay inside where it was safe. They told her that such a task should fall to the strongest of the defenders. Elizabeth lifted her chin. She told them that the men were needed at the walls. She told them that the lives of everyone in the fort depended on retrieving the powder. She said that she was small enough and quick enough to reach the cabin before the attackers could fire accurately. Her voice carried a calm certainty that left no room for argument. Her brother tried to stop her. He pleaded with her to stay inside, but Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm and met his eyes. She reminded him that their family had come to this frontier knowing the risks. She reminded him that courage had always guided their choices. She told him that the moment called for action, not fear. The gate opened just wide enough for her to slip through. She stepped into the sunlight and felt the heat of the day rise around her. The shouts of the attackers carried across the field. Musket smoke drifted through the air in thin clouds. Elizabeth took a deep breath. She gathered her skirts and began to run. Her feet struck the earth in rapid rhythm. She ran with the speed of someone who understood the preciousness of every second. Arrows whistled through the air behind her. Musket balls struck the ground near her feet, sending dirt into the air. But Elizabeth did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the cabin ahead. The fort watched in breathless silence. Men held their muskets but dared not fire, afraid to hit her by mistake. Women clasped their hands in prayer. Children stared with wide eyes. Elizabeth reached the cabin, her breath sharp in her chest. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room held the familiar scent of wood and dust. In the corner sat the barrel of powder. She moved quickly, scooping the powder into a smaller sack that she could carry against her chest. She tied the bag securely and paused only long enough to steady her breath. Outside, the attackers shouted. They had seen her reach the cabin. They prepared to fire again. Elizabeth knew she had even less time returning to the fort than she had coming out. She ran. Her legs burned as she moved. The bag of powder thumped against her chest with each stride. The attackers fired volley after volley. Arrows streaked through the air. Musket balls struck the ground so close she felt the spray of dirt against her skin. The fort erupted in shouts of encouragement. Soldiers leaned over the wall, urging her forward. Her brother called her name. The gate opened once more and men rushed to meet her. Elizabeth crossed the last stretch of open ground. Her breath came in short gasps, her vision blurred from the heat and the smoke. But she kept running until she felt the strong hands of the defenders reach out and pull her safely inside the gate. A roar of relief filled the fort. Elizabeth leaned against her brother, clutching the bag of powder. The men wasted no time. They distributed the powder to the firing positions. Muskets were reloaded. The defenders renewed their efforts with fierce determination. The battle continued into the evening, but with the fresh supply of powder, the fort held strong. The attackers finally withdrew, unable to break through. The people of Fort Henry survived because one woman had run through danger carrying hope in her hands. In the days that followed, Elizabeth became a quiet hero of the frontier. People spoke of her with admiration. They marveled at her courage. They told the story of the young woman who had risked everything to save the fort. Elizabeth accepted their praise with humility. She insisted that she had done only what the moment had required. Years later, when peace returned to the frontier and families rebuilt their lives, Elizabeth's story lived on. Parents told it to children by the fire. Travelers repeated it in distant towns. Her name became part of the history of the region. Her courage became a symbol of the strength that lived in the hearts of ordinary people. Elizabeth Zane proved that bravery was not limited to soldiers or commanders. She proved that one person, guided by love and duty, could change the fate of an entire community. Her run for gunpowder became one of the most celebrated acts of the frontier war. She showed that when fear rises, courage can rise higher. Chapter 23. Nanyehi, Nancy Ward. Nanyehi stands with the calm strength that guided her people through war and peace. The beloved woman of the Cherokee. The morning mist clung to the ridges of the southern Appalachians as sunlight slowly filtered through the dense canopy of oak and pine. The land breathed gently, full of birdsong and the distant murmur of the river that wound through the valley below. High on a rise near Chota, the mother town of the Cherokee, a woman moved with quiet purpose. Her step was firm, her gaze steady. Her presence carried a calm authority known to all who lived in the nation. Her name was Nanyehi, though many later called her Nancy Ward. She had earned her Cherokee title through bravery and compassion. She was a Gigo, a beloved woman, entrusted with the power to speak in council and to decide the fate of captives. She was a leader in a world that respected her strength and her wisdom. The early years of her life shaped the woman she became. She had grown up surrounded by the rhythm of Cherokee life, where families worked together, where the fields of corn and beans flourished under careful hands, and where the people believed in balance between land, heart, and spirit. She learned early that leadership did not come from force alone. It came from service. It came from protecting the people. It came from a heart that understood both courage and kindness. Nanyehi first stepped into the stories of her people during a battle in her youth. She had fought beside the warriors, carrying water, tending wounds, and helping load muskets when needed. During the fighting, her husband was struck and fell beside her. Grief pierced her heart, but she did not falter. She lifted his weapon and fought in his place until the battle ended. Her bravery became known throughout the nation. Those who witnessed her deed believed that she possessed a spirit strong enough to guide others. In the years that followed, she rose to a place of honor among the Cherokee. She became a voice of reason in a time of increasing tension between her people and the settlers who pushed deeper into Cherokee hunting grounds. She spoke often of the need for peace. She believed deeply that violence carried too heavy a cost for both sides. She understood that children, mothers, and elders suffered most when conflict grew. Her home near Chota became a place where people sought counsel. Women came to share their worries. Warriors came to hear her thoughts. Chiefs came to discuss matters that shaped the future of the nation. Nanyehi listened with patience. She offered insight drawn from years of experience. Her voice carried a quiet authority that settled hearts and guided decisions. As the winds of war swept across the colonies, the Cherokee found themselves caught between powerful forces. British agents urged them to take up arms against the settlers. American leaders insisted that alliances must be formed. Nanyehi watched the growing tension with deep concern. She understood the dangers that could rise from each choice. She believed that the Cherokee needed a path that would protect them from destruction. During one meeting of the Cherokee Council, chiefs debated fiercely about whether to join the British in fighting the Americans. Some argued that the settlers had taken too much land already. Others warned that siding with the British would bring retaliation from the Continental Army. The council grew heated. Voices rose in anger. Nanyehi stood. The room quieted. The men looked at her with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. She spoke clearly about the suffering she had seen. She reminded them that the Cherokee had lost villages to disease and hunger. She spoke of children who would pay the price if war returned to their lands. She told the council that peace was the only path that protected the future. Her words moved many. Her influence slowed the march toward conflict. But not all agreed. Some younger warriors ignored her warnings and formed their own plans. The war reached the Cherokee towns soon enough. Battles were fought, villages were burned, families fled through the forests seeking refuge. Nanyehi worked tirelessly to care for the wounded and the displaced. She fed the hungry. She comforted the grieving. She opened her home to those who needed shelter. Her leadership became a beacon of steadiness in a time of chaos. When American forces took prisoners, Nanyehi often stepped forward in council to argue for their release. She believed that mercy carried the power to change hearts. She believed that compassion could soften anger. In many cases, her voice saved lives. One story traveled through the nation and beyond. A small group of settlers was brought before the council. Some warriors demanded retribution for attacks on Cherokee lands. Nanyehi stood and placed herself between the captives and the council fire. She spoke of balance. She spoke of honor. She spoke of the worth of each human life. The council listened. In the end, the captives were spared. Word of her decision spread to the settlements, where her bravery earned her quiet respect among those who once feared her people. As years passed, Nanyehi continued to lead with a steady heart. She married again and worked her fields with diligence. She raised her children and grandchildren with compassion. She served in council long after the war had ended. She became a bridge between cultures. Settlers visited her home to seek her counsel. She offered hospitality to all who arrived in peace. She believed that friendship between the Cherokee and the Americans could hold back future bloodshed. She wrote letters to leaders in the new government urging fairness in treaties. She asked for honesty. She asked for respect. She asked that both peoples learn to live together without fear. The world around her changed quickly. Settlers continued to push westward. Land that had once belonged to her ancestors became fields and towns under new laws. Nanyehi watched these changes with a mixture of sorrow and determination. She continued to speak for her people. She continued to ask for justice. Though the tide of settlement did not stop, her work reminded all who met her that dignity lived in the heart of the Cherokee Nation. In her later years, she remained a symbol of peace. She sat by the fire telling stories of the early days. Children listened with wide eyes as she spoke of battles and brave hearts. She told them that strength came not only from the warrior's courage, but also from the leader's compassion. She told them that her people had survived because they cared for one another with unwavering devotion. When she passed away, the Cherokee mourned deeply. They remembered her as a woman who guided them through the hardest years. They remembered her as someone who held both wisdom and fire in her spirit. They remembered her as the beloved woman of the Cherokee, a leader who had stood firm when the world shifted around her. Her story traveled far beyond the Appalachian valleys. Historians wrote of her. Families shared her name with pride. Her memory endured because she showed that leadership could shine even in the darkest times. She proved that peace required more courage than war. She proved that a single voice, spoken with clarity and heart, could shape the path of a nation. Nanyehi's life reminds us that true strength rests not in power, but in the choices made for the good of others. She carried the hopes of her people through battle and through peace. She became a symbol of what it means to lead with grace. Her legacy lives on in the hills where she once walked and in the hearts of those who still speak her name with reverence. Chapter 24, Jane McCree. Jane in the forest, turning back in fear. A life that stirred a nation. The summer sun hung heavy in the sky above the Hudson Valley, warming the tall grass and the wildflowers that stretched across the rolling fields. The sound of insects hummed through the air, and a soft breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding woods. It was a peaceful landscape, full of quiet beauty, yet beneath its calm lived the tension of a land caught between armies. British forces moved steadily southward. American troops watched from the forests and hills. Each side waited for the next turn in a war that had already taken too much. Near the small settlement of Fort Edward, Jane McCrea lived amid these troubled times. She was known by her neighbors as a gentle young woman with a warm nature and a graceful presence. Her dark hair framed a face that carried a softness which drew affection from all who knew her. Jane lived with a family who offered her safety, and she spent her days helping with household tasks, reading, and writing letters to the people she loved. The war pressed close, but her heart still held hope for a peaceful future. Jane had long been engaged to David Jones, a loyalist officer serving with British forces under General Burgoyne. Their families had once been close neighbors, and their affection had grown in simpler times before the colonies divided. When the war pulled them to opposite sides of the conflict, Jane remained loyal to her love even as the world around them changed. She hoped that when the fighting ended, they would be reunited and begin a life together. As summer deepened, the British Army advanced through the valley. Loyalists and their native allies moved with them, and news traveled quickly of the danger approaching Fort Edward. Jane listened with quiet worry as neighbors spoke of raids that had taken place only miles away. Families began to gather their belongings and seek safety. Jane prepared as well, making plans to join friends who lived closer to the fort's protection. On a warm morning, she stood near the doorway of the house where she lived, looking out toward the woods. Sunlight touched her hair and made it shine with a soft glow. She held a small bundle of her belongings close to her chest. She planned to leave that day for a safer place. Her friends encouraged her to hurry, telling her that the British and their allies had been seen nearby. Jane nodded, though a trace of hesitation touched her expression. She hoped to move quietly without attracting attention. As she stepped outside, the calm of the morning shifted. Voices rose suddenly from the trees. Several native warriors emerged from the shadows, part of a scouting party working with the British Army. Jane froze as they approached. Fear raced through her, yet she remained steady. She knew they intended to take her to the British camp, where she believed David could secure her safety. She clung to that thought. The warriors signaled for her to follow. Their expressions were unreadable. Jane's heart pounded, but she gathered her courage and walked with them into the forest. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting patterns on the ground. Birds scattered as the small group moved along the path. Jane held tight to her bundle and whispered a prayer that she would soon see David again. The forest grew darker as they traveled. The air felt thick with tension, and Jane sensed that the men who led her were uneasy. They hurried their pace. Somewhere behind the trees, movement stirred. Another group of warriors had followed them, and confusion spread between the two groups. Voices rose in sharp tones. A struggle began. Jane's breath caught as fear gripped her heart. Stories of what happened next would vary through the years. Some said that the warriors fought over who would claim the reward promised for bringing her safely to the British camp. Others said that the situation spiraled out of control when one group believed the other intended harm. What remained certain was that in the chaos of confusion and fear, Jane's life came to a tragic end. When the forest fell silent again, the air held a sorrow that seemed to weigh upon the trees themselves. The warriors departed quickly, leaving behind a loss that would echo far beyond the place where she fell. Hours later, her body was found near a small spring, her bundle beside her on the ground. The news traveled swiftly to the British camp, where David Jones collapsed with grief upon learning of her fate. Those who witnessed his sorrow never forgot it. Word of Jane McCrea's death reached the American lines soon after. Shock swept through the camps. She had been a young woman caught in the tide of war, and her loss stirred emotions deeper than any military report could capture. Her story spread from soldier to soldier, then from settlement to settlement. People who had never met her spoke her name with sadness. They saw in her death the cruelty that war brought upon the innocent. The news reached General Burgoyne, who attempted to defend his allies by offering different accounts of what had happened. But his explanations only fueled anger. The Americans saw Jane's death as proof of the dangers they fought against. Her story became a rallying cry that strengthened the spirit of resistance throughout the region. Men who had felt weary found new resolve. Families who had doubted the cause felt renewed determination. Jane's life and her tragic end stirred a nation that struggled to hold fast in a difficult war. At Fort Edward, friends laid her to rest with quiet dignity. They placed her in a spot overlooking the land she had known, the land she had walked with hope in her heart. The wind moved gently through the grass as they prayed for her soul. The valley that had once held promise for her future now carried the memory of her final moments. David Jones mourned in silence. He carried her memory with him for the rest of his life, never speaking publicly of his grief, but never forgetting the woman he loved. In time, he returned to the land where they had grown up, living quietly and honoring her memory in the only way he knew, by keeping her story alive in his heart. Years later, writers and historians would tell her story again. They would describe her beauty and her gentleness. They would speak of the tragedy that shaped public opinion. They would reflect on how her life and death had influenced the course of the revolution. They would remember her not as a symbol alone, but as a young woman whose dreams were cut short by the tide of war. Jane McCrea remains one of the most poignant figures of the era. Her story endures because it reminds us that behind every battle lived the hopes and fears of ordinary people whose lives were forever changed. She reminds us that war touches not only the soldiers who fight, but the families and loved ones who wait and hope. Her life left a mark on the nation because it awakened hearts to the human cost of conflict. It stirred compassion, it stirred grief, it stirred determination. And in that way, Jane McCrea became part of the story of American freedom. Chapter 25, Mary Polly Cooper. Mary Polly Cooper brings food and comfort to the soldiers who endured the winter at Valley Forge. A gift of food and faith at Valley Forge. The winter of 1777 settled over Valley Forge with a severity that tested even the strongest hearts. Snow lay deep along the narrow paths that wound between the rough log huts. The wind pushed through the camp with a bitter cry that seeped into every crevice. Soldiers wrapped blankets around their thin shoulders and huddled near fires that provided more smoke than warmth. Hunger gnawed at their bodies. Exhaustion shadowed their eyes. Yet beneath the cold and suffering lived a spirit that refused to fade. General Washington walked through the camp each morning with a solemn determination. He heard the coughs of the sick and the groans of the injured. He saw men who still stood watch despite frostbitten feet. He felt the weight of the army's need pressing heavily upon him. Supplies ran low. Food ran out. Hope flickered but did not die. Far from the camp, in the land of the Oneida people, word of the suffering reached those who lived with deep respect for friendship and alliance. The Oneida had long spoken for peace and cooperation between their people and the colonists. They believed that relationships held power, and they valued loyalty as a sacred responsibility. When they learned of the hardship at Valley Forge, they gathered to decide what must be done. Among them stood Mary Polly Cooper, a woman known for her steadiness and compassion. Her hands were skilled in preparing the ancient white corn that had sustained her people for generations. She understood the ways of caring for the sick. She believed that food carried not only strength, but spirit. She listened as the council spoke of the American army. She felt a stirring in her heart. She knew that her place was with those who suffered. The Oneida loaded sleds and baskets with white corn, beans, and other supplies. It was not a simple gift. It was a sacrifice, for they shared what they needed to survive the winter. Yet they believed that generosity would return to them in blessings. Polly Cooper joined the group traveling to Valley Forge. She wrapped herself in warm cloth and prepared for the long and difficult journey. Snow covered the ground, but they moved forward with purpose. Days passed as they traveled through forests and across icy rivers. The wind stung their faces, yet their resolve never wavered. Polly watched the men and women around her, their steps strong despite the cold. She prayed quietly for the soldiers they traveled to help. She prayed for their protection, for their courage, and for the friendship that connected the Oneida and the American cause. When the group arrived at Valley Forge, the soldiers stared in disbelief. They saw sleds heavy with food. They saw the Oneida people standing tall with quiet dignity. They saw Polly Cooper, her face calm and filled with compassion. Word spread quickly through the camp. Men who had endured weeks of hunger stepped forward with tears in their eyes. They offered thanks with trembling voices. Washington himself greeted the Oneida delegation. He bowed his head with respect, knowing that their arrival had come now of deepest need. He spoke words of gratitude that rose from his heart. The Oneida did not ask for money or land. They did not ask for anything in return. They had come simply to help. Polly Cooper began teaching the soldiers how to prepare the white corn in the correct way. She explained that the kernels needed to be soaked and boiled with ashes or lye to make them safe to eat. She cooked pot after pot, feeding the sick and the weak. She moved through the camp with patience, offering warm food to men who had not tasted nourishment in days. Her hands worked quickly yet gently as she tended to the dehydrated and the feverish. The soldiers grew stronger with each passing day. They watched her with admiration. They spoke of the way she moved through the camp like a steady flame against the cold. Many said she was an angel sent in their hour of need. She only smiled and continued her work, believing that helping others was the path she had been given. When the sick slept, she sat beside them and placed a cool cloth on their foreheads. She whispered words of comfort. She prayed for their healing. She listened to their stories of home and shared memories of her own people. Her presence brought peace to those who had forgotten what warmth felt like. As the weeks passed, the soldiers regained strength. They rose from their beds with renewed determination. They trained with sharper minds and stronger bodies. They believed once more that the fight for independence could be won. Polly Cooper watched them with quiet pride, knowing that she had given them not only food, but hope. General Washington offered her payment for her service, but she refused it. The Oneida believed that friendship should not be purchased. They believed that giving freely carried its own reward. Polly accepted only a simple black shawl from Martha Washington, given as a symbol of gratitude and respect. Polly wore the shawl with honor for the rest of her life. When the Oneida prepared to leave Valley Forge, the soldiers gathered to see them off. Many of the men clasped Polly's hands and thanked her for saving their lives. Others touched their hearts as a sign of respect. Washington stood at the head of the crowd, his expression solemn and full of gratitude. He knew that the arrival of the Oneida had changed the course of the winter. Polly Cooper returned home with her people, carrying with her the memory of the camp and the men she had helped. She told her family of the suffering she had seen. She told them of the courage that lived in the hearts of the soldiers. She told them of the gratitude she had felt from men who once believed they would not live to see another spring. The Oneida Nation remembered her with deep respect. Her story passed from generation to generation. She became a symbol of compassion, generosity, and the strength of friendship between nations. Her gift of food and faith at Valley Forge became one of the most honored moments of the war. Years later, when new generations looked back on the Revolution, they remembered the alliances that helped shape the nation. They remembered that courage came in many forms. They remembered that kindness had saved lives. And they remembered Mary Polly Cooper, the woman who brought warmth to the coldest winter. Her legacy remains alive in the stories told by both the Oneida and the American people. She proved that even in the darkest moments, a single act of compassion could shine like a light across a cold landscape. She showed that generosity carries a power stronger than hunger or fear. And she reminded the world that the bonds of friendship can shape the course of history. Polly Cooper's gift endures as a symbol of love, faith, and the quiet courage that helps a nation survive its darkest hours. Afterward, the women whose stories fill these pages lived in a world shaped by war, uncertainty, sacrifice, and the fragile birth of a new nation. They did not know how history would remember them. Most never expected their names to appear in books or to be spoken generations later. They simply answered the needs before them with courage, faith, determination, and love for their families and communities. Some carried messages through dangerous territory where discovery meant imprisonment or death. Others opened their homes to weary soldiers, nursed the wounded, gathered food for hungry armies, or protected children while husbands and sons marched away to uncertain futures. They mended uniforms, stitched blankets, prepared meals, collected supplies, and worked fields that would have otherwise been abandoned. Their labor often went unnoticed, yet it helped sustain the struggle for independence every single day. A few stood boldly in moments of extraordinary danger. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a soldier and fought alongside men who never suspected her identity. Sybil Ludington rode through the darkness to warn the militia. Molly Pitcher stepped into battle when her husband fell. Nancy Hart defended her home with remarkable courage, while Prudence Cummings Wright helped stop a British courier carrying important information. Their actions remind us that bravery often appears when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. Others fought with quieter weapons. Abigail Adams challenged the leaders of a new nation to remember the rights and dignity of women. Mercy Otis Warren used her pen to inspire patriotism and defend liberty. Phillis Wheatley demonstrated through her poetry that talent, intelligence, and faith could rise above the injustice of slavery. Rachel Revere, Martha Washington, Esther DeBert Reed, Catherine Kitty Green, and many others strengthened the cause through leadership, encouragement, organization, and tireless service, rather than through battle. The stories of Nanya He, also known as Nancy Ward, Mary Polly Cooper, and other Native American women remind us that the Revolution touched every community across the continent. Their choices were often far more complicated than simple loyalty to one side or another. They sought peace when possible, cared for strangers in times of suffering, and preserved the traditions of their people while facing enormous change. Their experiences remind us that the American Revolution affected many nations, cultures, and families whose voices deserve to be remembered. Some of these women became widely known during their lifetimes. Many more quietly faded into history, their contributions overshadowed by the famous names of generals, politicians, and battlefield victories. Yet the foundation of every great movement is built not only by celebrated leaders, but also by countless individuals whose daily acts of courage make lasting change possible. As you close this book, remember that the American Revolution was never only a story of armies, battles, declarations, and famous commanders. It was also the story of mothers who comforted frightened children, daughters who carried secret messages, wives who managed homes and farms alone, sisters who cared for wounded soldiers, friends who encouraged one another through impossible hardships, and women whose steadfast faith gave others the strength to continue. Their courage still echoes across the centuries. May their examples remind us that true greatness is often found in humble acts of service, quiet perseverance, steadfast conviction, and compassion shown in difficult times. May we honor these remarkable women not only by remembering their names, but by sharing their stories with future generations. In doing so, we preserve more than history. We preserve the enduring truth that ordinary people, guided by courage and purpose, can shape the destiny of a nation. Their legacy belongs not only to the past, but also to the future. May it continue to inspire all who believe that faith, sacrifice, perseverance, and hope remain among the greatest forces for changing the world.